Marriage is like a tomb filled with hopes. Originally, this phrase didn't have a very negative meaning because it seems it belonged to a poem written to honor a very precious love. However, for our protagonist, marriage wasn't exactly a joy present in his life. In fact, it was more like a symbol of sadness, a little family life that made him extremely uncomfortable, where the relationship between husband and wife deteriorated every day, which is proven by a note left by his wife, informing him that she would spend the day out and asking him to eat without her. In this whole act, he had to pretend to be kind all the time, and it didn't matter how tired he was from having to take care of his children alone. In return, all the poor man received was the contempt of his own kids. Because of that, he had no intention whatsoever of being trapped in this hell forever. So, the guy decided to fully enjoy the wonderful life he had as a bachelor, ignoring the complaints of his coupled friends. After all, being single was wonderful. However, there was one small problem. Our boy was in a chapel talking to someone when he questioned why this person wanted to marry him. This was because that carefree life he had was about to end, and all because of that girl standing in front of him. Flashbacks of a night when the moonlight was the only thing illuminating the young couple came to his mind. He remembered very well how he pulled her hand, asking if she would like to marry the boy. The woman was beautiful and smiled at the enchanted boy. Suddenly, he woke up more serious than ever. He was in his bed alone, which meant it had all been a dream. It had already been a few months that he'd had the same strange dream, in which he was repeatedly proposed to by a woman he barely knew. And even if it was just a dream, to the protagonist, it was almost like a prophecy. Nervous, he wished it would never happen, especially because this kind of thing went against all his principles. But he was soon pulled from his thoughts by a knock on his door. It was one of his servants wanting to know if Raven was awake, so the man allowed him to enter. Thus, an older man opened the door, wishing the boy good morning, and asking if he had slept well the previous night. Without much patience for long conversations, the boy asked if there was something he needed to do that day to please a very well-known man. And the butler laughed, because Raven could never hide anything. Therefore, he decided to say immediately that his father wanted to see him. But something in Raven's expression indicated this was not good at all. Since he couldn't avoid his father's orders, he only asked the servant to send the message that he would meet him as soon as he was ready, and so he did. Meanwhile, on the other side of the castle, Raven's father waited for him, staring at the garden through the window. The boy arrived a little late, but he asked if his presence had really been requested. It was as if his father were surprised that he actually came, so he decided not to waste time and asked the boy to sit. Going straight to the point, he handed him a paper, explaining that he wanted him to marry the Lady of Charlene. That name was a huge surprise for Raven, who confirmed if he had heard correctly, and for better or worse, the man confirmed it was indeed her. His father had to be joking. There was only one reason why he would choose that woman. It was because the Lady of Charlene had been born into the Duke's family responsible for healing and purifying the entire empire. On the other hand, there was his own family, the family of Duke Deer, who fought monsters and got injured all the time. So Raven had no doubt that the choice of his future wife was motivated by that. However, there was one small problem, and it was the Lady of Charlene. After all, this girl was known throughout the kingdom for making men cry at her feet. Even though Raven hadn't had the opportunity to meet her personally, the girl had a great reputation within high society. She was a beautiful woman, no doubt, but the real problem was her personality. He remembered stories about how she once received a suitor who confessed all his truest feelings for her, and she simply told the boy to disappear. Because, according to her, the only thing he could ever be was her little pet dog. Indeed, she was a woman who hated men, so Raven couldn't stop wondering why she had agreed to marry him of all people. But the two of them ended up having one thing in common. If she was known for making men cry, he was known for making women cry. The two were well known throughout the empire because of their failed relationships, and the protagonist had the feeling that instead of having a friendly conversation about it, he would probably end up being killed by the Lady of Charlene. His father interrupted his flow of thoughts, explaining that everything had already been decided. In fact, it was an order from His Majesty, the Emperor, directly. So he warned that his son wouldn't be able to simply break off the engagement as he had done before. All of that was very confusing for Raven, who tried to argue by saying that his father probably already knew, but he needed to make it clear that he was only interested in casual relationships with women, exactly like him. Therefore, he didn't want to get married. However, the man explained that this wasn't a good enough reason to refuse a marriage like this, and if he dared to end this engagement, he would have to make his sister marry Marcus L., which also wasn't good at all for Raven since the Marquis was a pervert. Besides that, he argued that the two of them had a very large age difference, questioning if his father would really go that far just to please His Majesty so much. But the man coldly said that if he truly didn't want to sacrifice his own sister, he would have to give in. Suddenly, the butler entered the room, apologizing for interrupting the conversation. but he needed to inform them that the Lady of Charlene had just arrived, which surprised our boy. He had no idea how she had reached their estate so quickly, but the fact was that she was already there. The butler explained that he had taken her to the garden and suggested that the boy go greet her. It was then that everything clicked. The Duke had been planning this for a long time and had only revealed it to him at the last moment. Raven gave a dry cough, trying to avoid eye contact with his father. He was tense, but there was nothing more he could do. He wasn't going to let his sister marry a pervert, so he went ahead. And his father watched every movement, unsure of what his son would do. As stated, there was the Lady of Charlene in the middle of the garden, her hair swaying in the wind. Raven almost felt impressed by the scene. So that was the woman who made men cry, even though she looked harmless while smelling a flower. Noticing Raven's presence, she suddenly turned. Still thinking about what to say, the protagonist froze, because the figure standing before him looked exactly like the woman he had seen in his dreams recently. It was incredible to see that woman standing before him, because they were similar in a way that made Raven question whether the girl from his dream had materialized right in front of him. But he pushed that thought away when he realized how absurd it was, then approached the girl, commenting that it was the first time they were meeting, and introduced himself as Raven, the eldest son of the Dyer family. He took the opportunity to invite her to sit and have some tea. The atmosphere was strange, as if they were two teenagers on a first date, not really knowing what to say. Besides that, the girl had a distant look, as if she were an ice queen or something like that. But now that he had the Lady of Charlene in front of him, the boy was sure she wasn't as bad as the rumors said. He even considered that he might try to negotiate with her. So he explained that he wanted to hear a bit of her opinion about that arranged marriage. Perhaps for the first time since they'd met that afternoon, the girl looked deeply into Raven's eyes, before saying that she didn't care much. But of course, that answer didn't convince the boy, especially because it made no sense for a woman who hated men to want to get married. So he asked why she wanted to marry him. Then she set her tea aside, stood up, and walked toward Raven, who immediately grew tense. After all, why was she doing that so abruptly? But she explained, in an extremely seductive way, that she wanted to make the boy kneel before her. That was too much for him, and he was clearly embarrassed by the situation, trying to push the woman away at any cost. He stared at her as if he had known her for years, while the Lady of Charlene seemed indifferent to the whole situation, as if she ate men for breakfast every day. When he finally realized he was holding the girl's hand, he grew even redder, stumbling over his words to apologize. But the Lady of Charlene wasn't going to miss the chance to poke the wound and commented that despite the rumors she had heard about him, his reaction was quite naive, like a little puppy, which wasn't exactly a problem. If anything, it only made the girl want to tease him even more. While she laughed at the situation, the poor protagonist could only wonder what was wrong with that woman. So he tried to return to the main topic of the conversation, which was their marriage, and he went straight to revealing that he was against that insane proposal. He confessed that he thought the girl would be against it too, which is why he questioned the reason she had agreed to come all the way there and marry him. It didn't seem like a very comfortable position for the Lady of Charlene, but she tried to gather her words, and her hesitation left our boy even more intrigued. That meeting was definitely not going the way he expected, but things became even more complicated when the Lady of Charlene said it was because she liked Raven, who was visibly shaken. He didn't expect that answer even in a million years. He couldn't believe he was going through this situation all over again. Of course, he had broken hearts before. He remembered one of the girls who ended up at his feet crying, saying she loved him very much, but he wasn't falling for that anymore. He had enough experience to know that this kind of sentimental confession only hid people's true intentions. And almost always, those intentions weren't very pretty. Flashbacks of his youth came back. One day, he overheard the conversation of that same red-haired girl with her friends, justifying that marriage by saying that if they got married, she would be safe, besides gaining lots of money and status because Raven was a high-ranking knight. Of course, his beauty also influenced her choice, but there didn't seem to be many motivations for the union beyond that kind of superficiality. The woman commented that it would be great to make him her man, as if he were just another item on a store shelf at the mall. And apparently, Estrella was exactly like those other shallow and superficial nobles when it came to love. He didn't know exactly what the girl's intentions were, or why she was truly trying to approach his family, but he didn't plan to allow that marriage to happen. So, gathering all his courage, Raven made it clear that it was a shame, because he had already decided to never marry a woman who liked him. His words, although somewhat contradictory, didn't seem to affect the Lady of Charlene, who only stared seriously at her tea. But Raven didn't wait for a response either. He simply stood up quickly and made it clear that he had nothing else to say to her. And finally, he excused himself, leaving the girl there, reflecting on his words. As he walked away, although he had rejected yet another suitor, this time the Lord couldn't deny that the Lady of Charlene seemed to be an interesting woman. Maybe that was why it was better if they didn't see each other again. Suddenly, a sharp pain settled in his chest, making him stop in the middle of the path. And one of his subordinates who happened to be nearby noticed it, running toward him in concern as if they were true friends. When he got close enough, he asked if the prince was all right, and Raven quickly said nothing had happened. In fact, he was more interested in knowing what was going on among the knights there. Apparently, he was always this stubborn because the boy didn't seem surprised. He simply answered that Unit 1, which had been sent to explore a forbidden area, had informed him they had found high-class monsters. That set off an alarm in the young man, because that squad, sent by him, should have been able to finish off the monsters without any difficulty. Besides, until then, in all other missions, no monster had ever appeared without being summoned. That's why he couldn't waste any more time and told the knight that they needed to be withdrawn immediately. They were being watched from afar by the Lady of Charlene. The monsters in that zone were terrifying. Huge creatures that the knights definitely didn't expect to encounter. Even so, they were trying to hold their ground until their captain arrived. But it was difficult with those beasts getting closer and closer. Suddenly, our boy entered the scene, ready to fight with his sword and without fear, leaving his subordinates impressed. He praised them, saying they had done an excellent job. However, one of the knights asked him to wait before celebrating. But for the boy, it was simple. That was the power of the Guardian, a power that only he possessed and never held back. Coordinating his team, Raven ordered the other 2 units to check whether there were any monsters still alive. He turned toward the boy who had found him earlier to ask about the others who had been injured during the mission. But the boy made it clear that none of them had died, even though the situation was truly bad. However, their leader insisted on knowing whether at least they would be safe if they returned to their homeland immediately. And he ordered the first support unit to return to the mansion immediately to treat anyone who was injured. He informed them that the rest of the battalion would be waiting for them there. However, something very strange happened. Out of nowhere, petals began to appear in a pink rain, and one of his subordinates asked him to take a look at something else. But as soon as he turned, he was met with a surprise he still didn't know whether was pleasant or not, asking what she was doing there. That's right, it was Estrella, his suitor he had just rejected. So she explained that after their conversation, she had been ready to return home when she overheard part of that discussion about the monsters. Worried, the girl used her teleportation power to see what was happening in person. She examined one of the fallen soldiers, informing them that the miasma had taken him completely, but she would cleanse him with her powers. So that's where the petals were coming from. It was all thanks to that girl who is supposed to be cold and hate all men. The petals fell softly over those soldiers, healing their wounds in a magical, incredibly fast movement. Even the boy was surprised that all those people had been saved by just one person. Of course, his squad had healers who were very skilled, but that woman was on another level. She possessed an immense amount of divine power and could simply change an entire situation within seconds. However, that peace didn't last long, because soon a monster approached the girl, raising the alarm in our boy, who shouted to her. But the Lady of Charlene wasn't shaken at all, and in one swift movement, she brought the monster to its defeat, turning it into something pathetic and tiny, which she made sure to smack without the slightest patience. Meanwhile, the protagonist just stood there frozen, staring, shocked by everything that was happening, just like his entire squad, who never imagined a woman alone could cause this much destruction. But for the Lady of Charlene, it was just another day. After all, her favorite hobby was killing monsters. Score, 1x0 for feminism. One of the knights ran to the protagonist to say she had taken down a monster with nothing but a slap, desperately asking if he was hallucinating or if he had already died. But the boy didn't pay much attention. He just told him to step aside, because now he had another question in mind. Who the hell was that woman he had rejected just minutes earlier? The two exchanged intense looks, as if they could pierce each other's souls at that very moment. The boy tried to enjoy the victory, but Estrella suddenly approached, pulling his hand to promise she would always protect him, and asking Raven to marry her right there, in front of all his men. When he returned to his continent, he really wanted to enjoy the pleasant atmosphere of that afternoon, but that was now impossible, because the boy was on his way to the place of his death. All because, thanks to Lady of Charlene's public proposal, his life had completely changed. His companions, amazed by Estrella's actions, insisted that he needed to marry her. And no matter where he went, or what he did, there was always immense pressure from his knights, who had become the girl's biggest fans. They kept asking nonstop if he was going to meet her every day, and there was still something he couldn't understand. Although her divine powers were supposed to be used only for healing, for some reason the woman had managed to destroy those monsters. Divine power was a special energy capable of defeating monsters and miasma, and it was very different from regular magic, since the latter could be used by anyone. but descendants of those two divine families were the only ones capable of using that kind of power. The family of the Deer Knights and the family of the Charlene Healers. Until then, there had been no one who could master both types of powers at the same time, except for one person, a saint who had saved the entire empire many years ago. But he couldn't think too deeply about that now, because what really concerned him was the letter he received from Estrella asking whether he might be interested in entering a contractual marriage. An idea that to Raven was extremely confusing. He finally arrived at the girl's quarters, where she waited for him without much visible enthusiasm. As soon as he entered the room, the boy made sure to apologize for making her wait, but the girl made it clear that she had just arrived as well, and it wasn't a problem. After all, the place had a very pleasant atmosphere. After he sat down, the protagonist suggested that the two of them could come back another day if she wished, commenting that the owners often bought rare teas depending on the establishment, and they also served delicious pies. But Estrella didn't seem the least bit interested in all that chatter. She was there out of obligation. Her gaze ended up leaving our boy a bit unsettled, and he tried to cover it up by commenting that his sister had suggested that place, since it was apparently very popular among women. But he cut his rambling short by asking that the two of them get straight to the point. And the woman made it clear that her participation in demon subjugations was mandatory, but moving on to the other conditions of their marriage, she explained that it would be valid only until the boy officially received the title of Duke of Deer, and then she would refuse his properties and any other rights. These were excellent conditions for Raven, who had no idea what exactly the girl was planning, especially because she was known throughout the Empire for hating all men without exception. So he was more than curious to understand why she agreed to marry him, even after lying about loving him, a story Raven wouldn't buy in a million years. Besides, if she only wanted to enter a marriage with him for some personal benefit, she wouldn't need to lie about her feelings, like the redhead who tried to trick him in the past, much less lie about loving him. So they would have a contractual marriage, a type of union that wouldn't last forever, but considering the girl's incredible powers, his knights would never be in danger again. Thinking about that, Raven agreed that the two of them should begin a marriage proposal under those terms, something that left the girl very satisfied. However, the protagonist revealed that he still had one last thing to add. He explained that there were various rumors circulating about how he liked to have fun with women, so he made it clear that he would probably take a lover while the two were still together, in addition to not being the ideal man to make her happy, which made him seriously question whether Estrella would regret marrying someone like him. The girl lowered her head and thought for a moment, remembering one of her visits to the grave of someone very dear to her. But all she explained to Raven was that she had already lost many things, so she was tired of worrying too much, and she stated that she would not regret marrying him. It wasn't as if the protagonist was actually interested or concerned about the girl's well-being, so he simply said that if she agreed, then it was fine, signing the papers formally and handing them to her, saying she just had to sign and everything would be settled. Observing Raven, Estrella realized he seemed very kind, but had an attitude of not letting anyone enter too deeply into his life. That cold and distant look hidden behind a fake smile made her even more cautious. But honestly, if she were in his position, she would probably do something very similar. She only had to remember that there was a reason the two of them needed to be close. And with that in mind, she used her powers to sign the contract. She knew that only after completing that step could she proceed with her initial plan. Raven was shocked by that action, grabbing the girl's hand and shouting as he asked what the hell she was doing, to which the girl replied calmly that she had signed the contract with magic. But the MC became extremely aggressive, wanting to know why she did that, because under those conditions, if she broke her promise, she would have to pay dearly and would have nowhere to run. Coldly, Estrella confessed that she wondered who Raven truly was, because until then, she thought he was a heartless man, but now he seemed worried about someone he hated up until 5 minutes ago. The boy huffed, insisting on asking what she was talking about. Without meaning to, she let slip that the MC hadn't changed at all. So the protagonist questioned her comment, and she took the opportunity to return the question he had asked her about not worrying whether she would regret it, throwing it back at him, because she was certain he would be the one who ended up falling in love with her. And like the scared little puppy she had suggested he was, Raven backed away. That moment was far too amusing for the girl, who made it clear that this shouldn't be surprising at all. In fact, she knew the prince was destined to fall in love with her, because in another time, Raven had been the first to confess his unconditional love. It didn't take long for rumors about Raven's supposed marriage to spread throughout the palace. One of the maids even commented that they would have to prepare the couple's room as soon as the next week, so they would be very busy. Even so, the women seemed extremely happy. After all, finally another woman would be present there, and now they just needed to know who her personal maid would be. But one of the servants wasn't excited at all and simply said that she didn't care, as long as the mansion kept the same peaceful atmosphere as always. Her way of speaking left the two poor maids speechless. They knew the other maid was referring to a possible lover that Prince Raven had, and they doubted that the Lady of Charlene knew about her, a woman very different from Estrella, with light hair and an almost pure look in her eyes. At night, the boy was locked in his office as always, analyzing his documents when this woman arrived. It made him a bit tense, but he quickly opened a smile, saying he had been waiting for her and asking if she had arrived safely. The woman in front of him, the one who owned his heart, was named Catherine, and she walked in, pulling back her veil, explaining that everything was fine. This girl noticed the pile of documents spread out on her beloved's desk, and he asked her to wait a moment, but she seemed very impatient, pulling his arm immediately while the poor guy tried to explain that he would finish his duties soon. In fact, that woman was actually a man in disguise, complaining to the protagonist and asking why he had to dress in such a ridiculous way just to continue the treatment he was giving the boy. Something Raven justified with the fact that on another day, when he had gone to the mage's room, he was almost recognized. He had been applying magic to the boy, who seemed in great pain, when they were interrupted by Raven's subordinate searching for him, wanting to know if he was okay. The knight stood there watching, which was very bad. So, on impulse, the mage jumped on top of the knight, pretending to be just some random woman, and explaining that he was a bit busy, ordering the group to stop bothering them. To the subordinates, that situation was at least comical, but one of the men hurried to drag the other two away, who were far too curious, and shut the door while apologizing, leaving them alone. That night, the MC had to stay in a position that was, at the very least, embarrassing. And from that day on, he asked the mage for a little favor. Clearly, the mage was stunned. After all, it was an absurd idea, but he knew he couldn't simply interrupt the treatment. The Lord explained that he needed to hide from everyone the fact that he was undergoing a health treatment and ended up including Kate, his supposed lover's real name, into that insane scheme. Without any patience, he ordered the boy to lie down on the bed immediately and took the chance to ask how things were, to which Raven replied that he was much better thanks to the treatment because he no longer felt sick. In fact, he felt very well. However, Kate stared at him seriously. He knew Raven was lying and he was terrible at it. Even so, he tried to ignore it and explained that he would summon a healing spell so the boy could feel even better. No matter how many times he told the protagonist not to use his divine power, Raven didn't care at all. In that world, only direct descendants of the Dyer family possessed the rune marking them as guardians, and those people had an immense amount of divine power, incomparable to common mages. So much so that a single person could destroy hundreds of worlds. That was why the situation was so complicated. Raven was born with the blessing and the curse of having that mark. And even knowing that using all that power would lead him to death, our protagonist still used it to protect all his allies, and as a result, sacrificed his own well-being to save others. He was extremely stubborn, but Kate tried to keep quiet and simply said that the treatment was complete. However, the MC pushed back, saying his words didn't match his actions. The next day, the sun shone outside brighter than ever. Even the butler celebrated how beautiful the day was. But for the prince, it was practically the embodiment of hell. He was already out of patience with Henry and scolded him, since it was the 100th time he had said that. But the man explained it was inevitable, because he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He even tried to hold back tears while talking about the boy who was growing up and becoming a man, growing so much that he even wondered if he should start calling him Little Duke. Behind him, Raven followed without the slightest enthusiasm, begging him to do what he always did and not change that. Still, Henry confessed he was relieved that his little boy wouldn't die alone, and the protagonist made it clear that the woman he was going to marry was so straightforward that he doubted she had any common sense at all. But all the butler understood was that his beloved Raven was praising the woman for being wonderful and amazing. He absolutely didn't grasp the boy's true words. After all, Estrella was the type of girl who would say on the first date that she wanted to see him kneel before her, so he couldn't even imagine how she behaved with someone she truly loved. Meanwhile, the girl enjoyed her carriage ride, reading a book that would be very useful for her future relationship, because it was about how to make an inaccessible person fall in love with you. The first step was to make a first impression he would never forget, and that part was done. Then she needed to show everything she was capable of doing, which she had also done during the battle against the monsters. Now she was on the third step, which said that if the mind and body contradicted each other, perhaps they should spend some time alone, if you know what I mean. So all she needed to do was find a way to end up alone with him in a room. However, she needed to consider that Raven behaved like a wild animal around her, so he would probably try to avoid being alone with Estrella at all costs. But maybe she could tie him up to solve the problem, which wasn't a bad scene at all in her head. Even Estrella had to admit it wasn't a terrible idea. Of course, she couldn't rely too much on that logic because everything she knew about love was based on the romance novels she read. When she finally arrived, she regretted not having left a bit earlier. The house staff was lined up to greet her. and the butler was surprised to find his superior there, asking if he was in the garden to greet Estrella directly, which he confirmed. She stepped down from the carriage gracefully, meeting Raven's gaze instantly as he called out to her. It was almost theatrical. He said he had been waiting for her and called her his dear wife, lifting her in his arms as if they were in a romantic movie. Later in his office, the boy asked Henry what people's reactions had been to his recent engagement to Estrella, to which the man replied that those who had been working in the mansion for a long time were very happy. However, several younger people had arrived from the imperial capital and were worried about the situation, since they knew very well the rumors about his wife. Even so, he asked the boy not to worry, as it wasn't widespread enough to be a real problem. Still, he asked whether this would be an issue for Raven. The boy could only wonder if more malicious rumors were starting to appear about Estrella, because it felt like the same story repeating again. When he was a child, there were many rumors about his mother. She used to be the flower of the empire and had captured the hearts of many men, but the Duke, Raven's father, hated her. Other women said it was shameful, yet they understood the boy's feelings. But it was impossible not to find it ironic that she had a harem of men falling at her feet, but the one man she loved did not love her back. Her son called out to her, trying to distract her attention amid all that gossip. But her gaze was empty and distant. Now he was in the same situation, and it was impossible to know when Estrella would become the target of the nobility's rumors. And even if that weren't the case yet, he knew he would eventually have a problem with it, since communication was definitely not the Lady of Charlene's strong point. So he decided to take drastic measures, ordering his subordinate not to let anyone he considered dangerous get near the mansion. Besides that, he would personally ensure his wife's comfort. It was a strategic matter, like a game of chess, which was why he had reacted so dramatically to Estrella that morning, saying with a smile that he had been waiting for her, lifting her in the air and calling her his dear wife. That moment came as a surprise to the woman, and even to the Lord's maids who couldn't believe what they were hearing. When he set the girl down, Raven asked if she wasn't tired after such a long trip, suggesting she rest properly in her room before doing anything else. And he guided her there, leaving the staff speechless. The maids couldn't resist commenting that the whole thing was insane, maybe even unprecedented. Even so, the two continued walking, and while Raven smiled like a happy puppy, Estrella didn't look very pleased. It was as if they were aliens with so many people staring at them, and the maids followed them with their eyes until they entered the room, amazed by the scene. However, as soon as they were alone, the atmosphere changed completely. The first thing our boy said was that he had almost forgotten how to breathe, to which Estrella replied that she felt the same. Going straight to the point, the girl said it was better for the two of them to talk. But first, there was a small detail the boy needed to take care of. He explained that he had sealed the room with a soundproof spell so the two of them could talk 100% alone. However, what really caught Estrella's attention was the distance the protagonist kept from her, and she commented that he was far too far away to even begin a conversation, joking that she didn't bite. But like a helpless little puppy, Raven explained that this distance was the most appropriate for him. The poor girl couldn't believe she was actually going through this, and even when she tried to approach him, the boy only kept retreating. If he could, he would merge into the wall if necessary. Realizing that this would lead nowhere, Estrella asked that they continue the conversation, lovingly, if not sarcastically, calling him Mr. Puppy. And Raven replied with the same irony, thanking her for understanding his motivations and calling her Ms. Evil. The two of them were practically waging a cold war, even while smiling. And Lady Charlene herself acknowledged that that man was extremely annoying. His only good trait so far was his pretty face. Still, she sighed and explained that the whole thing was rather disgusting, but she wanted to know if he intended to continue, which the boy confirmed, explaining that it was even more irritating when people spread false rumors about their relationship based purely on assumptions. Besides, he shouldn't be in such a disadvantageous position. Of course, Estrella had to agree that it was better than being treated badly, especially in public, but she needed to ask whether his actions truly matched who he was. She asked if he wouldn't feel uncomfortable if rumors started about him being madly in love with the girl, even if that wasn't the case. Of course, Raven didn't trust his new fiancé blindly, but he couldn't deny that the two of them were going to get married, contract or not, so he would be bothered if people treated her badly. That's when it clicked. The reason he treated her as if he loved her more than anything in front of others was to protect her from those terrible rumors. In other words, for him it was just another task. So Estrella should convince herself that those actions had no special meaning whatsoever. After all, she couldn't bear to live indefinitely waiting for her future husband's kindness to actually mean something more. So, trying to understand, she asked whether Raven was in fact a good-hearted person or just a complete idiot. But before he could even answer, the woman interrupted him. approaching him and saying that if he was truly willing to do the bare minimum for their public image, then spending a night together with her should also be part of his plans. Raven stared at that shameless little woman, completely flustered. He was red as a tomato, and had probably just found someone as low as he was. Meanwhile, outside, someone shouted indignantly in the mansion hallways. It was the commander of the 2nd Squadron, Daniel, who questioned whether there was any possibility that his master had gone mad under the fiancé's spells, because it was hard to believe that the same man who ordered them to train instead of sleep had suddenly turned soft. Asher, who commanded the 3rd Squadron, was responsible for spreading this gossip, but his friend asked so many questions that he had to ask if he had trash stuck in his ears for not understanding the first time. Then the commander of the 1st Squadron, Theo, much more innocent, asked whether their master might truly be in love with Estrella, something the other two doubted very much. But they tried not to argue too much, saying only that maybe they would find out the answer soon enough. When they reached Estrella's room door, they noticed there was a spell being used there, probably a sound containment spell, but that wasn't a problem for Daniel. In fact, he saw it as an opportunity to barge into the room calling for his leader, asking why he was hiding in the middle of the day, only to find the kingdom's newest couple in an extremely compromising position. Their reactions varied. Theo looked hopeful. He probably believed way too much in his friend. Asher seemed indifferent, while Daniel was the most affected of the three. He immediately stepped out, apologizing for interrupting them, which left our boy even more desperate. After all, how could his own men plan to abandon him there with that predator? But Estrella just took the opportunity to tease him even more, suggesting that he was the one who had called her into that room in the first place. So she wanted to know what exactly the bare minimum meant for him. His loyal men, who had not fully closed the door and were therefore listening to everything, quickly argued that if a man invited a woman, he had to follow through. But soon they knocked on the door because they didn't want to hear the angry words Raven might unleash. Even so, it was unbelievable. Later, his men were drinking while the MC kept the same scowling face, until Asher approached and commented that it was very rare to see their leader stay mad about something for so long. Trying to cheer him up a bit, Theo brought a skewer to him, arguing that when he felt that bad, he would eat a lot and then go work out. But his master scolded him, asking him never to share that with Daniel, because Daniel was the type of guy who solved any inconvenience in his life using his muscles. Since why would he work out if he wasn't going to show off afterward, right? He was very straight bro gym type, and the boy nodded, understanding what he meant. However, he decided to change the subject and asked when exactly his master planned on having children, making the poor guy choke on his beer, because that was a completely unexpected question. But all that mattered to the commander, who didn't even seem like a real soldier, was that he would give all of Raven's future children lots of love, equally, regardless of whether they were boys or girls. And that comment made Raven smile, before explaining that he wasn't in the kind of relationship the boy thought he was. In the past, he thought he didn't want to be like his parents, and was sure that when he married, he would give everything he had to build the happiest family in the world. But that was when the MC was still a child, at least until the day he learned his fate, that the person who manifested the Guardian's mark would live a short life. So why would he bother building a family? What was the point of searching for someone who would truly love him? Because in the near future, he would simply disappear without warning. After his ancestors founded the Empire, out of nowhere, monsters and miasma began to appear, and the entire continent fell into chaos. And when everyone was lost in despair, a magnificent saint and a guardian knight appeared. Together, they raised a protective barrier that repelled all those monsters. And now, the people were protected by the Lady of Charlene's family, responsible for cleansing miasma and purification, and by the Dyer family, which ensured protection and subdued the monsters. Subduing these creatures had always been a very dangerous task from the cavalry's perspective. If the lady, with her divine powers and abilities, participated in the attack, the situation would be far easier to handle. However, they were attempting their first joint mission, and Daniel couldn't help commenting on how beautiful Estrella looked in uniform. They celebrated the fact that she was joining them on a mission, convinced it would be a wonderful journey, while the other servants talked about how Raven and Estrella made a great couple. All that chatter only irritated the poor boy even more, so he tried to shift their attention elsewhere, instructing his knights that from that point on, they would begin killing monsters, making it clear that it wasn't a festival or some fun task, but a hunt for dangerous creatures. This dampened the mood for both Estrella and Daniel, who had expected something completely different. After all, the Lady of Charlene could defeat all the monsters with a simple slap, so maybe she could help. They even argued that it would be difficult for her to keep healing them all, since she would need to gather the strength of at least 100 people for that. Raven tried not to explode immediately, masking his true emotion with a fake smile, before throwing a bucket of cold water on the two by saying he needed to make something very clear. The support squad would definitely reach them and continue providing help as always. Meanwhile, his men, exactly as they always had, should focus on destroying the monsters. This only frustrated the guys even more. They thought they would at least gain some advantage by having that woman there, besides her pretty face. Estrella simply watched everything in complete silence. Kate, the only one who seemed to be on Raven's side, soon approached, saying that the preparation of the portal had been completed, so they could teleport at any moment. In a hurry, their leader ordered them to pull themselves together and head to the portal, calling his future wife along. Taking advantage of them being alone in that brief conversation, the woman mentioned that it would indeed be faster if she simply participated in destroying the monsters, so she wanted to know why he wouldn't include her. The protagonist thought for a second before responding. He reminded Estrella that eventually she would leave them for good. So even though he agreed with his subordinates that it would be far easier to just let her deal with the monsters directly, he needed to worry about what would happen to his team as soon as she was gone. What did she think would happen when everyone got used to relying on that kind of help? That was true. And the Lady of Charlene knew there was no way to argue against it. So the boy continued, saying that this was why he found it more beneficial if she only worked with them from a certain distance and supported them in other ways, including the fact that he himself was placing his own life in her hands in order to receive that protection. He was always so distant that their coexistence bordered on coldness. With nightfall, the men returned. It had been great to defeat those monsters, at least for one of them. Daniel especially commented on a surprise attack by the girl, who killed another monster attacking their support squad with a simple punch. He didn't even know it was possible for her to do that using only her hands and powers. Estrella was a little surprised by this cheap flattery. However, although he didn't want to admit it, Raven was impressed. She had paid a lot of attention to the participants, their movements, and helped them according to that. And because of it, the monster subjugation had gone better than usual. The two ended up exchanging glances unintentionally, as if our boy truly wanted to escape Estrella's eyes. She quickly explained that the monster had tried to attack first, making it clear that she wasn't trying to show off or anything like that. But that wasn't what he thought for even a moment. In fact, he only smiled, commenting that even though she had to protect herself, she chose to save the lives of their medics, thanking her, which was a surprise. But the friendly mood quickly disappeared when the boy ordered her to go to the support squad and ask them to purify her, because she had been corrupted by the miasma. Then he dismissed his team. He just didn't expect the woman to yank his cape, explaining that she would be the one to purify him. The poor guy even tried to say it wasn't necessary, but it was already decided. Realizing resistance was useless, he simply extended his hand, giving in and asking her to do it. But the girl wasn't convinced. She thought it might even be some kind of joke, since everyone knew that when it came to purification and healing, it was best to have extensive skin-to-skin contact. So she ordered him to remove his clothes immediately, which honestly wasn't a bad idea considering those sculpted abs. And just like that, Estrella began her healing process. She commented that although he was physically fine, his magical mana had stagnated a bit, so she suggested that maybe he wasn't sleeping well. Therefore, she said he should rest more. The boy was embarrassed. He probably hadn't been this vulnerable in front of someone in a long time. She touched him, and at that point, he no longer knew whether she was actually using healing magic or just taking the opportunity to enjoy herself a little. Meanwhile, Raven could only think about how he usually felt a bit uncomfortable around Estrella, and the girl knew that so many women had already fallen in love with Raven that even nearby countries knew about his cases. They dreamed of experiencing even a moment of his warm embrace. She had heard many rumors about him, good ones and bad ones. He had also been painted as a terrible person, known for not respecting the girls he dated. However, no matter how bad the gossip became, his popularity was never shaken. Because of that, Estrella took the rumors circulating among high society as something normal, but now she wasn't so sure, and felt she needed to ask. Gathering what little courage she had left that day, she asked whether the man in front of her, who looked like a stallion, was actually nothing more than a virgin. The moon shone brightly above the mansion. After that extremely embarrassing question, our boy was taken to the room by Estrella, who was now in a very favorable position for both her and him. She stared down at him, unable to believe that this was indeed the boy's first time. However, he asked her to calm down, suggesting that the two of them talk first. But she simply ran her hands along that sculpted, God-given abdomen before asking whether he really wanted to talk right now. When she began approaching the well of happiness, the boy screamed for the lady to stop. And suddenly, our boy woke up shouting for her to stop and saying he'd had enough of the situation. Beside him was Kate, watching him with a suspicious look. And when he realized it had all been nothing more than a dream, Raven couldn't believe it. After all, it had felt extremely realistic. At least now he understood the reason he had fallen into such a deep sleep. He was in the middle of his treatment. The MC tried to compose himself, reminding himself that it really had just been a dream, while the mage wondered whether the lord had awakened from a nightmare. It was still night outside, but as soon as the protagonist composed himself even a little, Kate asked if the girl had really found out that he was a virgin. And although Raven couldn't see it that way, for his friend, her finding out at that point was great. After all, he only benefited from those rumors of being a womanizer to avoid the obligation of marriage. So now that he was engaged, he no longer needed to rely on that, and the boy would have to agree, even if he didn't like it. However, for the protagonist, it was a problem that he was giving in to Estrella, especially because it was terrible knowing she knew his secret. He could imagine the girl revealing it to everyone, saying that he was such an inexperienced boy that she managed to make him kneel at her feet. He was already teary-eyed looking at the mage, who quickly cut that whole scene off, telling him to stop looking at him like that, because there was nothing he could do. But he argued that even if the girl found out, the two of them wouldn't have any problems. Even so, our boy insisted that it was extremely embarrassing for her to know that he, of all people in the kingdom, was a virgin, so he no longer knew what to do. That day, he had done everything possible to maintain his composure. Kate was no longer entertained by the conversation, so he said it was already very late and said goodbye to the boy. However, Estrella ended up seeing him leave the room. She stared at him, unaware that it was not a woman at all, but a man. Naturally, she grew curious about who that lady was. It had been 2 weeks since the Lady of Charlene had moved into the Duke Dyer's mansion, and thanks to Raven's plan, her life had been quite peaceful. In fact, the two of them had grown close enough to call each other by their first names. Or at least, that was what she thought. Because judging by the boy's reactions to any interaction between them, she realized he had truly never fallen in love with anyone. To her, it was as if the MC had never even spoken to a woman who wasn't a relative, which made her question whether even half of the rumors circulating around the kingdom were true. One of her maids was doing her hair when she noticed the girl lost in thought and asked if something was bothering her. She replied that she had seen a woman leaving the Lord's room last night and wanted to know if the maid knew anything about it. Nervously, the subordinate apologized but explained she didn't know anything. Estrella noticed her hands trembling. She knew it was an absolute lie. Standing up, she made it clear that the woman didn't need to apologize. After all, because Raven was her master, she wouldn't say anything without his permission. And as a servant, that was the bare minimum she could do. She had caught the girl red-handed, even if the maid wouldn't admit it. Still, the noblewoman continued her speech, saying she was happy that the maid served her fiancé with such loyalty, which made the servant realize the woman was very different from the rumors she had heard. In fact, she must love Lord Raven. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been so kind. As she walked through the corridors, Estrella reflected on what she had seen, and now that she thought about it, she didn't believe the protagonist had any malicious relationship with the girl she had seen leaving his room the day before. However, she was still a rival, and whenever a rival appeared in her path, Estrella never backed down. After all, she was known as the most cruel woman in the Empire for a very good reason. Along the way, she caught sight of her perfect reflection in the window, which made her wonder whether there existed any woman better than her. Honestly, I wish I had this girl's self-esteem. After this moment of ego, the girl noticed what was happening outside the mansion, concluding that perhaps it would be good to take some precautionary measures. In the garden, the soldiers gathered for their usual training, including Raven, who needed to exercise to maintain that Greek god physique. He called his subordinate's attention, saying that after the break they would return to training in the arena. That's when something caught his attention. Or rather, someone. Estrella, beautiful as always, wandering through the garden. Defensive, the protagonist immediately questioned what she was doing there and whether she'd gone to the garden just to provoke him. The lady didn't understand why he always acted like he was walking on eggshells around her, but that didn't matter. She simply decided to get straight to the point as usual, suggesting that the two of them have lunch together, which left Raven a bit stunned. Even so, he agreed, asking if that was all she had to say, and the girl said no, calling him on a date for the next day. That was even more confusing. When people talked about going on a date, it was always described as something pleasant, like having a romantic lunch together. And afterward, they would tell their friends all about it, like teenagers. He even noticed one of his soldiers chatting with a colleague about how he had a hot night after his date. Hot night. Those words echoed in Raven's mind more than ever after the dream, or nightmare, he had about Estrella. He knew that if he accepted going out with her, he would definitely end up in her bed. The poor guy couldn't stop thinking about how terrible Estrella was for inviting him on a date right after discovering he was a virgin. And considering her, at the very least, eccentric behavior, there was only one correct answer to her invitation. He couldn't go on a date. Even saying it with a smile, it was still a no. He explained that he wasn't afraid of going on a date with her, but he had many plans for the next day, even apologizing. The girl laughed right after, thinking that was all. But Estrella was an extremely persistent woman, and she grabbed him by the shirt with ease, leaving the little puppy trapped. He even prepared to run away again, but had no success at all, since the lady of Charlene refused to let go of his clothes. Stressed, he asked how she had so much strength. Calculating as always, she laughed darkly, saying that if he didn't want to stay there willingly, she could squeeze his little air-filled head until she got a satisfactory answer to her question. So, laying all the cards on the table, she repeated the question. Are you really very busy the next day? And if he lied, he'd pay to see. Even though he was upset, the protagonist could only answer that maybe he wasn't busy tomorrow. Again, he said he didn't mind going on a date with her, but he made it clear he needed to return to the mansion by 7 at night, and that was his only condition. That comment made Estrella wonder whether there was some sort of curfew at the Dyer mansion or something like that. But in Raven's mind, if he got home by that time, the girl wouldn't attack him like harmless prey. Poor boy. Even though she found it strange, she agreed, making the protagonist sigh in relief. At least until the girl shoved her finger in his face, saying he needed to promise. It seemed a bit childish, so the MC asked whether she was really proposing a pinky promise. But it wasn't the interlacing of pinkies that sealed the deal. It was just that, for her, it symbolized he couldn't break his promise. Even though he didn't like how that sounded at all, he gave his hand to the girl, locking pinkies with her like children. When they finally separated, the girl looked satisfied. Even so, since she always loved making him nervous, she warned that if he ran away again, he would regret it. And finally, she turned her back on the boy. Honestly, he had absolutely no idea what went on in Estrella's head. The thing was, when you made a pinky promise and broke it, something would happen to your finger. Something small, like an accidental cut. So under those conditions, even the most insignificant promise became very important to both of them. It was a habit the girl had never managed to abandon, which showed how important Raven was in the Lady of Charlene's life. That day flew by, and night fell over the castle, where the Lord was alongside his loyal attendant. Now he had a much bigger concern than the date itself. What on earth did one even do on a date? Maybe they could go boating on the lake that was known for being a romantic spot. Or maybe something simpler, like having a snack at a cafe. Either way, it was a lot to think about. Luckily, one of his knights knocked on the office door asking permission to enter. It was Asher, explaining that the 3rd Squadron had already returned from the investigation. Basically, the results of the investigation of the Forbidden Zone, where the monsters had reappeared, showed that a pool filled with miasma had also emerged, as expected. And these monsters appeared once every 2 or 3 years, all directly from that pool. However, if they left things as they were, they would not stop appearing. After all, although that phenomenon was rare and the last time it happened was 60 years ago, it was still a possible reality. A pool of miasma was also known for being a sign that something strange would happen soon. The year it appeared for the first time had been an unfortunate one, so they needed to act immediately. Thinking about this, Raven ordered them to raise a barrier and deal with the situation right away, so that the monsters wouldn't appear again. However, when Asher asked whether he wanted to go with the team the next day, the boy refused. He explained that of course they needed to take care of the situation as quickly as possible, but tomorrow was definitely not a good day. So he decided to go alone right at that moment, shocking Kate. Asher was more relaxed and even laughed while asking if he had plans for the next day. He knew very well who Asher was referring to. Raven didn't seem like the type to hide things, so he simply explained that he had promised Estrella the 2 of them would go on a date, which left the knights speechless. And the commander of the 3rd Squadron was the first to react, shocked that his leader preferred going on a date instead of destroying terrifying monsters. But he realized something more urgent was happening, so he asked if Raven even knew how to behave on a date, because if he didn't feel very confident, he could help. The protagonist politely refused, knowing Asher was offering only because he also knew the rumors about Raven being a womanizer were false. But in any case, Raven asked him to let him handle the miasma pool, telling the guy to rest and visit the healer to cleanse himself first. Even though the boy had refused his help, Asher was determined to give him his dating guide anyway, convinced his master would need it. In the forest, Raven had indeed gone alone to check what was happening, surprised to find that scene. He had finally reached the miasma pool, which looked like a frightening black hole. He tried to be quick, immediately invoking his powers and transmuting that strange mass on his own. Ever since sealing that portal for the first time, the danger of monsters appearing had decreased, but to eliminate the possibility completely, he would need to request cleansing from the Lady of Charlene's family. Suddenly, the boy felt malicious eyes watching him from other creatures, but that didn't shake him at all. He simply knew he had to begin his hunt for now. The next day, the moment had come for him to go on that date, the one he had accepted thinking it would be a great way to pass the time. And now, here he was practically touching lips with his fiancée before the wedding. The night before, the boy had spent a good amount of time hunting monsters alone in that abandoned forest, until he opened the teleport portal to his office, surprised to find someone awake there. It was Kate, who had waited for his master until then. But Raven didn't see that as something good and even scolded the knight, saying he should have gone to rest. Kate argued back, saying it wasn't the time for that, especially since Raven was trying to destroy his own health, telling him to keep that little smile on his face for as long as he could, considering the consequences he would face for going alone on a mission. As always, Kate sat him down to use healing magic. He scolded him, asking why he had worn himself out that much, since he could have gone on a date any other day instead of risking himself alone. It wasn't a lie, and the boy knew it well. This time, they were dealing with something urgent, so it really would have been better if he had postponed the date. However, he explained that he didn't want to break a promise, but that only made his right-hand man more alert. How come he had made a promise to that crazy woman? Raven quickly defended himself, saying it wasn't anything deep like a pact. If he were honest, he was also confused about why he had gone so far just to keep his word to Estrella. Anyway, complaining wouldn't solve it. He had made his choices, and the next day arrived, bringing their date with it. During the trip, the protagonist was more nervous than ever, especially considering Estrella wasn't taking her eyes off him. She didn't say anything, but he couldn't stop wondering why she was staring at him so intensely. And it was very strange that she was sitting there quietly. Either way, he just hoped she wasn't thinking anything bad. Don't be fooled. She wasn't mesmerized by his beauty. She was actually searching for the right answers to her question. Her mind was focused on her book about how to make someone fall in love with you. She was still on step number 3, the one about mind and body being out of sync, suggesting the couple should spend time alone. Already exhausted from all that staring, Raven finally asked what she wanted. Without hesitation, the woman asked if his heart didn't race when he looked at her. That was a bit frightening, so the protagonist returned with another question. He wanted to know what exactly the girl meant by that. Maybe she had messed up the previous step when she tried to give him an unforgettable impression, and now she was there trying to listen to his ribcage like an idiot. Or maybe for Raven, who had already played around with several other women, she hadn't provided enough stimulation for that to happen. In that case, maybe if they brought their faces closer, just like the characters in her romance novels, she could get something out of it. She was using her favorite book as reference. I fell in love with The Saint of the Kingdom, a popular romance with amazing characters. Whether by fate or pure luck, the carriage suddenly shook, throwing the two of them to the same side, and Raven was quick to protect the girl's head so she wouldn't hit it hard. He apologized, asking if she was hurt. However, Estrella wasn't worried at all about her health or well-being. She asked if now his heartbeat had sped up, to which he replied that when he was with her, no matter how fast his heart could go, it could always beat harder. They finally arrived at the date location, the finest boutique in the South. The girl had to admit she was a bit impressed. Because it was such a famous shop, it had even reached the imperial capital. They were quickly welcomed by the owner, who said she had been expecting the couple. She made it clear it was an honor to meet the Lady of Charlene, and introduced herself as Ada Blau, the owner and designer of the boutique, a countess. Putting his acting skills to use, the boy explained that he had come to give his wife a beautiful dress, and also wanted to choose a design for a gown she could debut at the banquet. Something Madame would be very happy to do, and she immediately offered to show them her latest collection, leaving them in the care of one of her employees. They were nervous because the Lady of Charlene was known as a selfish woman who lost her temper if she disliked something, and now that she had the support of the Dyer family, she could simply destroy anyone who hated her. Ada had already heard these rumors about the lady, and if they were true, she truly needed to be careful not to offend her, even unintentionally. At the moment, she was showing some pieces of jewelry, and Raven stared at the earrings as if he were some kind of fashion expert, at least until someone caught his attention. They were praising his wife a lot, and with good reason, because the woman looked stunning, wearing a long dress that showed a bit of her legs, like a true femme fatale. Madame noticed he was speechless, so she encouraged him by asking whether he didn't think the Lady of Charlene looked incredible in that dress, something Raven had to agree with. However, he wasn't great with compliments, so he ended up saying she looked like a very cute gorilla. He definitely couldn't say everything that went through his mind if they were anything like that. The woman approached with her arms crossed, suggesting the boy had a serious problem in the head for calling her a gorilla, and asked if maybe a slap would put his brain back in place. But Raven, sarcastic as always, said he thought the problem was with her, not with him. Then the woman told him to explain what he meant by that, unless he was a total coward. That scene was hilarious to watch. Apparently the rumors were just that, rumors, and Ada Blau stepped into the conversation, commenting that the two of them got along very well. It was almost cute. And to please the boy, she offered to prepare another dress. The prince could not believe that, and he asked whether it was really necessary to try on another dress, but Estrella was already about to do it, since, as the Lord had said earlier, she was only fulfilling her minimal obligation. Besides, she made it clear that if this was a present he wanted to give her only to protect her, then in the future she wouldn't need it. That seemed to offend the boy a little. So he explained that it wasn't an obligation. In fact, it was an act of gratitude, because the girl had saved the life of a member of his squad. Also, she came from the north and probably didn't own dresses suitable for the climate here, which was why he wanted to give her a present. Even the dress she had worn the day before was way too warm to wear in the south at that time of year. She could have used that as an excuse to ask for new clothes, but instead she stood there with her arms crossed, insisting she didn't need more clothes and that one dress was enough. Trying to dodge all that stubbornness, the boy explained that if the issue was money, the Dyer family had no problem with that, because even if he bought the entire stock of that shop, it wouldn't affect his fortune at all. That was why he would be happy if she simply accepted the gift without hesitation. Giving in a little, the lady of Charlene still tried to come out on top, telling him not to complain when she ended up spending all his money later. Staring at her, Raven thought that when they first met, he had only assumed Estrella was an arrogant young lady, but now that he had seen her flustered, he wanted to know her even more. Maybe he really did have a problem in his head. Before she left, the boy remembered a detail. He asked her to wait a moment and picked up one of the pieces of jewelry he liked most. He approached her, asking permission to touch her hair, something that wasn't a problem for Estrella, even if she found the closeness a bit sudden. Then the MC extended the flower hairpin and explained that when he saw it, he thought it would match her very well. He gently pulled a strand of her hair to place it, confirming his suspicions. She looked very beautiful. That was enough to throw anyone off balance, including the lady of Charlene, who was now redder than a ripe tomato. She stared at the boy without knowing what to say. When he realized what he said could be interpreted in other ways, Raven made sure to clarify he was talking about the hair accessory, completely changing Estrella's expression, who had looked almost hopeful, but was now very confused. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, and soon the protagonist burst out laughing, asking if she really thought he was talking about her, reminding her that even if he had complimented her out of nowhere, he was still referring to the accessory. That was enough for the visit to the shop to end. And poor Ada Blau insisted they come back another day while Estrella stormed out. In the end, he really did buy all the clothes she approved of, and Raven complained that after the slap she had given him earlier, his nose was still sore. She offered to use a bit of healing magic if the pain was that bad, but the boy refused with his usual pride. The boy asked if she wasn't tired from trying on so many dresses, suggesting they stop by a popular cafe nearby, but the girl had another place in mind. They walked through the market, and the Duke was immediately recognized by the citizens. Some women also commented on how handsome he was, while the boy was more concerned because people were calling them over to approach the stands. However, Estrella seemed very happy, which she justified by saying the atmosphere there was very different from the north, and just watching people live their lives was very nice. Ever since she learned, thanks to Daniel's big mouth, that her future husband liked that place, she had wanted to visit it right away. They passed by a genuinely in-love couple, exchanging compliments as if it were completely normal. And the lady of Charlene couldn't help but look at them a bit enviously as they held hands. Then, in a quick gesture, she reached for the hand of her supposed beloved. He was startled by the gesture and immediately pulled away. She commented that his reaction was extremely rude, asking whether he thought she was going to break his hand for him to have pulled away so suddenly. But the protagonist made up an excuse, saying his hands were very cold, and that was why he stepped back. Estrella knew it was a blatant lie, but she was too tired to argue. So she simply sped up her pace and said that in that case, he didn't need to hold her hand, and she would go ahead alone, which made Raven think maybe she believed he was complaining. But his thoughts were quickly interrupted when he noticed the girl had already continued walking through the market. His wife seemed far too entertained by the stands. It took him a long time to spot her again, and a bearded man asked whether she was the lady of Charlene. At first, a small crowd of citizens gathered around her, all asking the same thing. So she was the lady of Charlene from all the rumors? A cheerful woman laughed, commenting that she couldn't believe someone so beautiful had become the Duchess of that place, and that she was very happy to finally meet her. Another girl said she had just passed by her and Raven and that they looked very cute together. Considering all those people surely already knew her terrible reputation, the woman was being very kind, as was her husband. However, it was the first time the girl had received so much kindness from so many people at once. She didn't even know what to say, to be honest, and that began to draw people's attention. One of the girls nearby commented that the lady still hadn't responded, and her friend replied, suggesting she didn't want to talk to commoners. And besides that, her appearance resembled that of a witch. That was enough to trigger terrible memories in the girl. She remembered a man saying it was all the witch's fault, as if she were the reason the monsters had appeared, that she had to be sacrificed and left for the terrible creature to devour. She became so lost in that spiral of thoughts that she didn't even bother responding. She only managed to escape that mental fog when Raven approached. He stepped forward, saying he was glad to know his wife was so popular. However, they were in the middle of a date, so he asked that they not delay them too much. And so, the people drew back, wondering if they had done something wrong, and quickly dispersed so as not to bother them anymore. However, someone caught Estrella's attention again. A very kind elderly man asked if it wasn't too much trouble, she would return to the market another day. It truly seemed like the first time someone treated the Lady of Charlene like a real human being, which made her smile. She couldn't find the right words, but her smile was genuine. The girl sat on one of the bridges nearby, being watched by her fiancé, who had been afraid a fight would break out after they called her a witch, but she said nothing. In fact, at that moment she acted as if she had nothing to say, as if anything she spoke would enter one ear and leave the other. He apologized for leaving her alone, and explained that he had known everyone there since he was a child, and probably should have said that before they arrived, since that would have made it easier for Estrella to talk to the people. But perhaps a bit embarrassed, the girl said it wasn't his fault. Before she could continue, the MC tossed a plush kitten onto her lap. She held it, even without knowing how to react, listening to the protagonist comment on how the little toy resembled Estrella. It was a plush cat he had bought the moment he saw it, because the resemblance was obvious. Then, in a friendly gesture, extending his hand to his fiancée, he made it clear that there were many more interesting things to see in that place, and she wouldn't even notice how fast the day would go because of it. Thus, Raven asked that they continue their date, gently holding her hand for the first time that day. In fact, the day flew by. The two shared food, and the boy wiped off some whipped cream that his wife had thrown on his face. Staring deeply at her, he realized he was being watched, because Estrella was applauding what must have been the best performance of the greatest womanizer of the empire. When the sun was setting, he suggested it was time to return. Estrella was smiling, this time genuinely, with her plush kitten. Now that she could think a little earlier, the girl had been completely overwhelmed by her husband's kindness, but now she needed to ask something. She wanted to know why Raven was so kind to her, a question that caught the boy by surprise. He even had to think for a moment before answering. However, if the girl had known beforehand what the answer would be, she certainly wouldn't have asked. Somewhat confused, Raven asked why she suddenly wanted to know that, and she replied that she was simply curious, insisting on knowing why he had treated her so well during their whole outing, even if he didn't trust Estrella very much. So he explained that he could only not trust her because he didn't know the real reason she decided to marry the MC, and he gave her a chance to tell the truth. But the lady countered by asking whether it wasn't unfair to answer a question with another question, insisting that he explain why he was so kind to her. Thus, Raven apologized for not explaining earlier, but the real reason was that his knights treated her very well. He even asked if she had purified all of them the day before, because Kate had said the previous night that while the prince was in the miasma pool, the princess had purified all the members of his squad, which had surprised him. Maybe she had suddenly decided to cooperate with his plan. That's what the MC thought, but that wasn't all. Besides this good deed, she had also said she wanted to purify the boy, and made it clear she would wait for him to return, but Kate convinced her to go back to sleep, since she couldn't reveal that her master had seizures. So, after so many of the girl's observations, the protagonist concluded that regardless of her intentions, she would never harm his knights. Besides that, lately it felt as if Raven couldn't leave the girl alone, almost like taking in a stray cat. But the reason it was so easy for him to interact with his wife was because she didn't like him. This confused the woman even more. Seriously, could that man be any less normal? But unlike other times, she wasn't going to give him the benefit of the doubt, so she asked him to explain. Thus, Raven explained that he was glad there were no romantic feelings between them to interfere with their relationship. After all, if she had truly liked him from the beginning, the two of them would never have signed a marriage contract. He had already decided he would never marry a woman who loved him. His answer made the Lady of Charlene tremble, and even though she was afraid of the answer, she asked what would happen if she did in fact fall madly in love with that boy. But Raven knew that wouldn't happen. Even so, he answered that when that moment arrived, their relationship would already be over. They returned to the castle at night. Estrella lay in her room, now accompanied by her new pet. She stared at it as if she could stare directly at Raven in that moment, and she repeated her fiancé's words. When that day comes, our contractual relationship will end. She didn't believe that. What an absurd statement. And even if he said he wanted to know the reason she wanted to marry him, he would never believe her, even if she told the truth. Because the truth was that in her past life, the two of them had been a couple. The girl said that out loud, hugging the cat as if it were truly Raven, like she was confessing to him. She knew that if she revealed the whole truth, he would think she was insane. And now she had to be even more careful than in her past life. 1 year earlier, during a banquet celebrating the nation's anniversary, the girl remembered very well the night they first saw each other. There was nothing special about that day. She was bored, trapped at that party with nobles, staring at her drink and trying to enjoy her own company. She was already so exhausted she planned to leave, but then she heard one of the boys comment that Lord Raven had arrived. That name wasn't unfamiliar. Of course not. He was the eldest son of the Dyer family, now surrounded by people flattering him, which made her question whether people really needed to put on such a show just to win the sympathy of another noble. But at that moment, it was as if time had stopped before her eyes. The girl couldn't believe the image in front of her. That man she certainly already knew. That man she had loved once. That day, the strange, unexplained ache that had always lived inside her was replaced by a sweet, deep longing, as if the sun had begun shining inside her chest. She didn't know how or why that was happening to her feelings. Yet, realizing that Raven had no idea who she was, Estrella wondered why he had forgotten all those incredible moments they had shared in past lives. The protagonist had simply walked past her as if she were no one, making the girl cry. That was why she wanted to meet him and find him again. That day, she couldn't express herself at all because she was so angry. She felt like an idiot, because regardless, she truly wished she had found him. But when she saw his figure in front of her, she was terrified. She ran out of the ballroom, rushing into the hallway, throwing herself onto the floor, crying. She knew that if he had any memories similar to hers, he would surely hate her. Back then, she hadn't even realized all of that, much less remembered it clearly. But now it didn't matter anymore. She was there because she had sworn to do everything possible and impossible to ensure the happiness of the man she loved. However, ever since she arrived at the mansion, things had gotten out of her control. Since coming to that place, she had done nothing but stand beside Raven, allowing herself to feel things she absolutely could not feel. When her goal in coming there was to earn redemption for her actions, she was certainly being punished by her own ambition. The next day, in the training grounds, the Lord observed his soldiers while thinking it was time to find a squire and a lady-in-waiting for Estrella. However, he was suddenly called by one of his subordinates. It was Henry who approached the boy with fire in his eyes, saying he had gone too far this time and ordering him to come to the castle entrance. Worried, the boy asked what the problem was and what exactly he had done, until he noticed the presence of a small child there. A child who was basically the protagonist's copy and was now asking if he was his father. A little earlier, before all of that happened, he had said goodbye to Estrella. She didn't even give a friendly little wave to her fiancé before leaving. She looked very different that morning. The day before, she had asked to visit a bookstore they had seen during their outing, and so he allowed it, but Raven tried not to worry. After all, Estrella was well enough to go exploring by herself. Maybe he was just overthinking the situation. Meanwhile, his knights were engaged in a much more poetic activity, gossip. Theo was excited to know what the commander had said to his fiancée, and Daniel seemed to be filling that role, reciting his words. As much as I adore seeing how admired my fiancé is by you all, we are on a date. So may I have her attention back? They knew that because his men acted as secret escorts during the couple's date. The commander of the first squad couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was almost like listening to a drama. Everything ended the moment Raven arrived, giving Daniel a flick on the head. He didn't say much, just laughed ironically, commenting that they seemed to have plenty of free time to discuss such nonsense, so they should get back to training. He took the chance to smack Theo as well, since he was the most interested in that kind of thing. The protagonist definitely needed to choose one of his men and a maid to accompany Estrella. That way she could go wherever she wanted, just like she did that day. That's when the butler called for his attention, saying that the boy had crossed the line and needed to go to the entrance. Confused, the boy asked what he was talking about and what he had supposedly done, until he heard someone saying they were very happy to meet him. The little child who looked just like Raven, asking if he was his father. The boy froze right there. He had no idea what to say. After all, it's not every day that you meet a possible child. So pointing to himself, he asked if that little creature was really referring to him, and the boy laughed, confirming it. He seemed to be having a great time, unlike our protagonist, who was horrified. Theo, who never misses gossip for anything in this world, immediately realized what was going on. A lost little boy claiming to be his commander's son. It was exactly like a romantic novel he had read, where an illegitimate child suddenly appears. Meanwhile, the butler, who was already on the verge of tears, asked when exactly he had fathered this child. But fortunately, Raven had a very solid alibi and made it clear that he was definitely not the boy's father. Of course, he couldn't admit he was basically the prince of virgins, so he had to come up with an excuse quickly, or at least try, while being stabbed by the child's sad little stare. Instead of trying to justify himself to Henry, he crouched in front of the boy and asked where he had come from. The child was about to answer when he suddenly realized maybe that wasn't a good idea. With eyes filling with tears, he asked if, once he answered, the man was just going to throw him away. Even though the protagonist said he would never do that, he most definitely was planning to. Still, he tried changing the question. He preferred to know how old that creature was. The boy responded by holding up 3 fingers, then changed it to 5, but clarified that he would turn 6 that year because he was already very grown up. He had to admit, the kid was pretty cute, Suddenly, Daniel cut into the conversation, asking them to wait a moment. He started forming a line of reasoning. His commander was 24, meaning that when this little boy was born, Raven had just graduated and left school. But Daniel couldn't finish his thought because he took another punch to the face. And the protagonist shouted that enough of that madness, because in any case, there was absolutely no chance that child was his. However, it was hard to stay firm after seeing the little one staring at him with those abandoned puppy eyes, making the poor guy grit his teeth. He didn't understand why the child looked so much like a younger version of himself. Had he somehow fathered a child by accident? He couldn't imagine anything more horrifying. And finally, Kate arrived. He knew Henry wouldn't let this go, so he interrupted the conversation, explaining that he had studied at the same academy as Lord Raven, and he was so dedicated that he graduated as the top student of his entire class. After that, he threw himself into the world on a monster hunting campaign. Therefore, he had been far too busy to have a child, so it was very unlikely that boy was his. And he suggested that instead of continuing with that meaningless conversation, maybe it would be better to invite that young boy inside, telling the other soldiers not to get carried away with their fantasies. So they went in. A while later, with the Lord already in his office, he asked the servants how the child was doing. They responded that he didn't need to worry, because the boy was under the care of Theo and Daniel, who were basically a married couple. Without much patience, Raven decided it was time to discuss the matter, and the butler informed him that the details were still being checked. But after inspecting the boy's belongings, he concluded that he was a relative of Estrella and a member of Viscount Chebest's family. That was new. A relative of Estrella? The protagonist immediately asked if she might be involved in this, but Henry didn't believe that was the case. Of course, there was still a lot they didn't know. However, apparently the Chebest family had many debts because its patriarch had become addicted to gambling. In that case, there was a high possibility that the boy had been sent there to be sold. In the past, there had been several cases of children sold off by their family heads, since it was a common custom among aristocrats to adopt children out of nowhere. Even if they claimed it was adoption, in reality they were just buying and selling children who were valuable to rich and malicious nobles. It was pitiful that they had let such a young child go all the way there alone, but at the moment they had very little information about him, and there were many things they didn't know. However, regardless of Viscount Chebest's intentions, they must never accept that child. That's why Kate made it clear that if anything bad were to happen, they would have no choice but to get rid of the boy at once. The knight's suggestion was absurd enough to make his master rise from his chair, and even Raven, who wasn't exactly the kindest person, had to admit that it was too much. He commented that his knight was always extremely sinister in those situations, but he made it clear that even if they ended up in trouble, they were not going to kill that child, and he wouldn't allow the boy to do that. He asked if Kate had forgotten the promise between the two of them. They were still children when it happened, so it had been a long time. Even so, the boy never forgot that commitment, so Kate apologized, acknowledging he had been rash. Thus, the protagonist ended the conversation, explaining that there was too much uncertainty for now, so it was far too early to make any kind of decision. He dismissed the servants quickly. The butler guided Kate out of the room, even though the knight clearly wasn't 100% convinced he had made the right choice. Meanwhile, Raven watched the two leave, thinking about how cold the boy was. But he also knew that the Empire was responsible for Kate ending up that way. His full name was Kate Lopes. He was the heir and successor of the Lopes family, a family that had served the Dyers for many years, doing whatever was necessary to protect the head of that household. Because the Dyer family controlled the protective barrier of the entire continent, they often became targets not only of imperial supporters, but also of neighboring nations. So, to serve the Dyers with loyalty, the Lopes family established that they would kill and die for them if needed. That was simply who they were. They had been rigorously trained from a young age since childhood. When he thought about it, Raven concluded that things were improving little by little. Even so, he knew it still wasn't enough, because he truly wished his friend could live a normal life. Far from there, in the bookstore, Estrella was browsing through some books. She was trying to decide what her next read would be. She was torn between a novel called I Swapped Bodies with the Doki Doki Prince and If I Could Become Your Maid. Asher approached, asking if she was having trouble choosing something, which she confirmed. That made him smile. Apparently, he understood quite a bit about romantic novels. Warmly, he said that if she wanted something lighter, she should choose the one on the right. But if she preferred a novel with more tense development, he recommended the one on the left. It was impressive how much he knew about these things. Then he explained that he had gained plenty of knowledge thanks to his former girlfriends, though he had no intention of telling her that part. Even so, the Lady of Charlene stayed thoughtful for another moment before choosing her book, deciding to take I Swapped Bodies with the Doki Doki Prince. He had seen that behavior a few times at parties, and apparently it had become very common for Estrella. Asher stepped closer, changing the subject a bit, saying he had heard of a very effective method to make someone notice you. He couldn't believe he was actually receiving advice from a single love-starved servant. He knew the woman was beautiful and understood why his captain was worried about that, so he decided to help by explaining that forcing the situation wasn't helping. She could try a calmer approach. He suggested that if Estrella suddenly started acting indifferent, everyone would get curious. It was an unexpected method, one that had never crossed Estrella's mind. She could only remember Raven's words about how he was grateful there were no romantic feelings between them. That day, she couldn't find the words to answer, but now she could explain to Asher that nothing was wrong with her. This made him curious, and he asked whether she had no feelings for his captain. "I don't like him," was what she should say, even if it was a lie, but she couldn't. So she just turned her back, saying the night was wrong. Apparently, he had said something that wasn't his business, so he apologized, saying it was a very indecent question to ask. Trying to redeem himself, he said he knew another bookstore with an amazing section and invited her to take a look. That seemed to cheer her up a little. Maybe books really were her only comfort in that whole situation. As night fell, the little boy found Estrella. He called her name loudly and ran to hug her. She was surprised to see Na-hwi there, returning the hug while not understanding what he was doing in that place. But the boy asked if she had forgotten that she promised she would become his mother, because she said she would formally adopt him if she got married. Definitely not the best way to reveal this to her future husband. And apparently, the boy realized he had said too much, even though Estrella hadn't scolded him. But she didn't reprimand him. She simply patted his head and admitted that she did say that. Before her fiancé could oppose it, the Lady of Charlene told Raven not to misunderstand the situation because it had been an agreement between her and Na-hwi. Confused, but trying to be open-minded, he asked if she could explain it better. Then she revealed that the child was the son of Viscount Shebest and his third wife. His name was Na-hwi Shebest. The Viscount was the younger brother of Estrella's father, which made Estrella and Na-hwi cousins. And about the promise he was surely very worried about. The girl explained that once a year, all her relatives gathered at the mansion, and it was in one of those occasions that she met the boy. A year ago, at the Charlene family mansion. The two were in the same room, and while Na-hwi was drawing, she was doing something else. He kept staring at her while Estrella flipped through her book, which seemed to be a common occurrence. The boy had drawn the two of them in a very cute way, and then let slip that he wished Estrella were his mother. In an innocent impulse, he asked if there was any chance he could become her child. What worried her even more than the fact that the boy already had a mother was that he believed she should become one. Then Na-hwi revealed that his real mother had died when he was still a baby. The Lady of Charlene didn't seem very moved by the story, so she simply turned her head and said she understood, and told him he could do whatever he wanted. But that was enough to spark a hope in Na-hwi that would never fade. However, she warned him that it probably wouldn't be possible right away, which made the boy ask when it would be. It was a huge problem she had created for herself, but she answered that maybe when she got married, she could adopt him. Now that she was explaining all of this to her actual fiancé, it sounded absurd. But to Raven, the real absurdity was that Estrella actually thought he would fall for such a story, even stressed. She made it clear that she didn't make that promise to the protagonist with any kind of scheme. Even though it happened before she regained the memories of her past life, she knew she had said something very irresponsible to the child. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed disappointed that Na-hwi was not his master's illegitimate child and not the product of Estrella and Raven's love. That opened a very fun opportunity for Estrella, who loved playing with those men's feelings, and she pretended to cry, about to say that they had indeed had an affair. But Raven had zero patience left and just told her to cut it out. After all, they hadn't even met before, right? For the first time, Estrella revealed that they actually had, which left the man even more stunned. When he tried to question the Lady of Charlene, she simply asked if they could discuss the details of that when they were alone. And so she prepared to leave, being informed that the protagonist had prepared a guest room and asking them to rest. Then the girl walked out, holding the little boy's hand carefully, leaving the men there without understanding what had just happened. As night fell, Estrella entered the room, making sure Na-hwi was already asleep. She couldn't contain her smile upon seeing that calm, innocent child. She pulled the blanket up, afraid he might catch a cold. However, something caught her attention. The boy's chest was covered in bruises. She couldn't believe it. She knew that ever since Na-hwi's mother died, he hadn't exactly been treated well. But this was crossing the line. Suddenly, the little one opened his eyes carefully, sitting up a bit confused and asking what had happened for her to be there. He asked if she was feeling sick or something like that, but the woman quickly denied it. Then the boy lay down again, saying that was a relief. However, sounding a bit sad, Na-hwi asked whether someone had gotten angry or hurt because he had gone to the castle alone. That question caught the girl off guard, but she tried to keep a cheerful tone as she replied that no one with common sense would dare go against her. Then, changing the subject and tucking in the child, She said it was better for him to focus on going back to sleep. Even with the sweet words of his future mother, Na-hwi still apologized for coming there alone and for causing trouble for her, repeating his apologies several times. The next day, the three of them were eating together in the dining hall, but Raven noticed something very unusual about the boy. He seemed nervous, trembling at the table, and since he didn't move, Raven asked whether he didn't feel like eating or what was going on. Still shaking, Na-hwi answered that he would eat. However, he accidentally dropped his knife on the floor. Even if it was an accident, the child felt as if a fire alarm was going off in his head. He remembered how things were for him in his family's palace. Every small mistake earned him a beating. He couldn't afford to make mistakes here either. He knew he would be punished if that happened, and was already prepared for it. However, the reaction he got was completely different, because the protagonist approached and gently patted his shoulder, and kindly asked him to hand over the plate so he could cut the sausage for him. That was a huge shock. The poor kid was so traumatized he believed he deserved harsh punishment for dropping a utensil. Even hesitant, Na-hwi handed his plate to the protagonist. Afraid of the worst, he apologized for letting the knife fall, but the Lord wasn't worried and simply said those utensils weren't made for children, so they were probably hard to use anyway. While cutting, he asked if the size was okay for the little one to eat. Estrella couldn't stop smiling at Raven's kindness toward the boy. He acted like a real father, asking if everything tasted good and telling him to eat as much as he wanted. Na-hwi answered that it was really delicious. After that, the boy went outside making a pose as if he were casting magic, which was enough to leave the castle's favorite knights mesmerized. When the magic came out of his hands, even Na-hwi was impressed. This seemed to be the first time he managed to do it. Blue lights filled with mana flowed from his fingers rapidly, while he stared at them in pure joy. He jumped into Estrella's arms, celebrating that he could use sacred power too. The men called him a little genius, while she simply said that was expected for someone from the Charlene family, celebrating that the boy would be a future healer. Raven soon appeared as well, proud of the boy he had met only recently. Daniel approached his commander and asked whether the boy couldn't join the Knight Order, because he would surely become a great warrior. But the protagonist's concern was that Na-hwi was still very small, so who would take care of him? However, for Daniel, the answer was obvious. He would take care of the child. Despite his handsome playboy appearance, he was married and father to 5 other children. Seeing his master's unimpressed reaction, he asked whether that wasn't enough to make him agree. But he quickly broke the comedic moment by clarifying that he was actually being serious about the boy joining the squad. He was keeping an eye on the children around, so he knew when someone had potential. And little Master Na-hwi was very attentive to adults and well-behaved. Besides, even with his own son missing, it wasn't as if the Viscount's family had started searching for him. So he concluded that the boy wasn't very important to the Charlene family. This made Raven thoughtful, but it didn't last long, because Estrella approached him asking if he had a moment for the two of them to talk after that. Looking at Na-hwi, who was now happily in Theo's arms, she explained that she really needed to talk to him about the child, something he revealed he also very much wanted to do. When the two were already alone in one of the mansion's rooms, the girl apologized for being so direct, but she needed to ask something about the child, seeing the curiosity in her fiancé's eyes. She then asked if, at least during her stay there, she could keep Na-hwi with her. The boy thought for a moment before refusing, which made the Lady of Charlene angry. Even so, he insisted, saying that the child needed to return to the Viscount's house as quickly as possible. It was absurd to hear that from someone who, moments earlier, was smiling like an idiot just from interacting with the boy. Estrella's eyes were wide open, completely shocked by her fiancé's words, at least until she lowered her head as if disappointed. Then, trying to convince him at any cost, she clarified that as soon as the contract between them ended, she would take the boy back, even saying that if he didn't believe her, they could add a new clause to the contract. But she was interrupted by Raven, who made it clear that no matter how many times she asked, he wouldn't change his decision because he couldn't protect that child, even if the boy was being hurt by his own relatives. It was cruel, even for the protagonist, in my opinion. The girl's voice came out trembling for the first time after so many conversations, asking if he knew that reality. Why was he making that choice? But he had a better question. If he accepted the girl's crazy request, did she understand what evil people might think about this situation? They would twist everything to fit their own interests and convince themselves that if this child deserved so much pity, maybe they could protect him. Others might try selling more children to gain a direct link to the Dyer family. But even so, those kids could end up mistreated in the end, receiving the same treatment Na-hwi did. The girl knew he was right. If they accepted Na-hwi, other children would appear trying to get pity from the Dyers using the same method. However, if they sent the boy back like that, who knew what horrible things might happen to him? So she clarified that she understood his argument, but wanted him to at least consider protecting the boy at the Charlene house until he could get his father's permission. A bit coldly, the protagonist asked why the Dyer family should go so far just because of the woman's personal motivations. My God, this man is stepping completely out of character. And he continued, reminding her that the two of them weren't a real family. They were only in a contractual relationship. Those words hurt the Lady of Charlene more than she expected. She thought about yelling at him and ending him right there, but chose another approach, admitting he was right and saying she was wrong, apologizing for causing such confusion. After all, at the end of the day, they were just two strangers sharing a house. Even though the door was closed, Na-hwi heard the whole conversation from outside. He knew there was no hope left for him. Later, in one of the garden gazebos, a banquet filled with delicious sweets was served, but the boy looked like he had seen a ghost. He shared afternoon tea with Estrella, who quickly asked what had happened. The little one tried to find the right words, but lowered his head. Then, with a fake smile, he revealed that he really wanted to go back home. That made the girl suspicious. Maybe he had overheard their earlier conversation, so she moved closer gently, explaining that he didn't need to go back if he didn't want to, and if he was worried about causing trouble for someone else, he didn't need to, because she herself would guarantee that the boy would never have to return to the Viscount's house again. Even so, he backed away saying that wasn't it. Actually, he was just tired of being there, because he was far from his father, and also didn't have any toys, so it was very boring. It was sad to see a child forced to act like an adult because of Raven's bad choices. However, there he was, insisting that he wanted to go back home and even asking if it was forbidden to do so. The next day, a carriage was prepared for Na-hwi, and the knights said their goodbyes to him, thanking him for having taken care of the little one. Even though he tried to hide it, he couldn't erase those hopeless puppy eyes. But then he stepped into the carriage, which departed, watched by Estrella as if she wished she could go back in time and protect that child from everything. Inside the vehicle, the boy's fake smile dissolved into a flood of tears. He definitely didn't want to go home. He wanted so badly to stay there with all those people he had just met, since they had shown him what it was like to be cared for the first time. But he also didn't want his presence to cause even more arguments. He cried his heart out, trying to convince himself that he was a very strong boy. But deep down, he was only a child and shouldn't be going through that. In the middle of that farewell, Raven was inside the palace staring at a painting of his family from when he was still a child. He seemed regretful of his choices, wondering if he had been right or not. His reflection, however, ended when Henry found him. He had come to inform him that little Master Na-hwi had already left, but the protagonist didn't have much to say about it, or at least didn't want to. However, the butler knew him well enough to realize things were not fine. He tried asking if there was any regret, which confused our boy. So Henry explained that when he first met Na-hwi, he couldn't help remembering his young master, because when Raven was younger, he kept getting hurt trying to protect the servants. Trying to help Raven a little, he asked if the boy understood that it was okay to be a bit selfish sometimes. So he asked if the MC truly didn't want to protect little Na-hwi, making our boy think, before answering, because he felt any reply wouldn't be good enough. Even so, he said he believed he had made the right decision, but the butler insisted. He wanted to know if the feelings Raven said he had were actually true. The boy commented that it was strange seeing that man so sentimental about this issue, joking that he must really be getting old. Then he prepared to leave. But alone with his thoughts, he knew his true desire was to protect that child. However, even if his intentions were good, he wouldn't make a promise he couldn't keep in practice, because he didn't know how long he would live, knowing he would eventually cause problems for everyone left behind once he died. He couldn't leave any trouble for his knights, who had always been by his side, because he couldn't protect everyone. The next morning, in Estrella's room, two maids asked why she was packing her bags. So the woman simply replied that it was because she was returning to her home. That alone was enough to cause confusion between the two, and even for me, because why was she leaving? When the two poor girls fell to the floor, she asked if they were anemic or something, telling them not to worry about her and to rest right there. But that wasn't why they had reacted like that. Still, the Lady of Charlene wasn't going to waste time and explained that she needed to confirm it with Lord Lopes, asking where he was, to which one maid replied that he was probably in the office at that moment. That was enough for the woman to disappear, leaving the two maids stunned in the room. The previous day, she had no choice but to send Na-hwi away, because her fiancé made it clear that the Dyer family had absolutely no intention of protecting that child. But even knowing she was in a terrible position in that whole mess, Estrella would have to act alone, as long as she was careful not to cause problems for Raven and the others. She had to hurry to go after Na-hwi. As mentioned, Kate was in his office signing document after document. When he heard the knocking on the door, he immediately allowed whoever it was to enter, receiving Estrella, who already had her suitcase in hand. The two stared at each other coldly. Before the man asked her to sit, the girl said that since she would be leaving soon, there was no need. and she explained that she wanted to return to her house to stay there for about 2 weeks, and had come to speak with him to make sure that this wouldn't affect any plans of subjugating monsters. To which the knight replied that 2 weeks was an acceptable amount of time. However, he couldn't help asking if the reason she was returning home had anything to do with Na-hwi, and Estrella didn't lie. She simply confirmed it. So he explains that obtaining legal custody of the little one from House Shebest through a formal procedure would be, at the very least, challenging. But the young woman says she already knew that, and if she were truly going to follow that path, it would not be a problem. According to imperial law, minors naturally belong to their parents. So it was impossible to force parents to give up custody of their children just because the environment was abusive, as was Na-hwi's case. But this was a matter only relevant in court because if the Viscount's family agreed to give custody to Estrella without resistance, everything would be resolved with no issues. The Lady of Charlene makes it clear that they would force those monsters to relinquish custody of Na-hwi, no matter what it required. Concerned, Kate asks her to at least be careful when she goes back. However, it might end up being a pointless trip. This catches Estrella's interest. But before he can explain what he means, someone enters the office. Raven. And the scene Estrella sees is definitely unexpected, because there was Na-hwi in the protagonist's arms, as if he had never left the castle. The little boy immediately jumps into Estrella's arms, celebrating. While the woman can't even react, she just stares at her fiancé, completely shocked. So naturally, he becomes the target of questions, especially because he had been against this decision not too long ago. However, Raven explains that Henry's interference had worked. When they finished that conversation and walked away, the man had gone after him quickly and warned that he was going to get involved, but couldn't stay silent, revealing that he had reviewed official documents, and one of them stated that if someone with divine power personally enlisted another person, even a minor could serve, regardless of age or parental approval, and he suggested that Raven had added that clause specifically because of little Naru. After all, until then they had housed the child with no formal consent, and if House Shebest wanted to accuse them of kidnapping, they would have no defense. But if that draft document were approved, they could request custody of the little one without any issue. Of course, only if Raven wanted that. But the protagonist, stubborn as always, crossed his arms saying he knew it wouldn't be that simple, because even if His Majesty approved it, the nobles wouldn't accept it so easily. And those already opposed to House Dyer would see the perfect opportunity to strike back. And if, in the middle of that process, anything happened during the Lord's absence from Dyer Mansion, then Viscount Shebest would have failed to protect everyone under his care. Therefore, as a son of House Dyer, he could not act so selfishly. Henry lowered his head, confessing that it seemed the boy's servants had caused many problems for him. He remembered seeing Raven as a child, covered in bruises simply for defending his subordinates. So now he wanted to make up for it, begging the young man to let them handle something for once. Begging, please, for Raven to trust them and accept their help. It wouldn't be easy. However, the old man brightened, saying they would face anything together. In that moment, it was as if he were looking at little Raven again, who, even beaten up, still smiled, saying he was happy none of the servants had been hurt, and he thanked the now-grown man for his trust. Sometime later, Estrella went with the boy for a walk in the garden, only to be surprised by the presence of the protagonist, who froze the moment their eyes met. But the woman turned away, convinced, and was called by the young man. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had truly been ignored by that woman who, in his mind, should be worshipping him for having struggled so much to help Na-hwi and satisfy her wishes. Before that dreadful incident in the training grounds, Asher was shouting that what they were doing to him was unfair and calling his opponent for hand-to-hand combat. And Daniel, who was his opponent in that moment, teased him, saying the weakling was starting to bark, but Theo interrupted, saying it was better to just finish everything quickly, asking for confirmation from the Demon Lord, who laughed while his cloak fluttered. In reality, the four knights were playing with the mansion's new resident, who was calling himself the terrifying Demon Lord. Playing along, the commander of the 3rd Squadron ran away, pretending to be scared. Inside, Estrella was talking privately with her fiancé, trying to understand if he was really saying that if someone had divine power like Na-hwi, that person could become a probationary member even without parental consent. However, what worried her was whether the Emperor would approve of that. But Raven made it clear they probably wouldn't have any problem with that, justifying that the Emperor himself was eager to train the next generation, so he would approve the idea without a second thought. Even though she wasn't fully convinced, the girl tried to reassure herself that Raven was very close to His Majesty. So if he was saying that, then there wouldn't be many issues. She only asked to speak with Na-hwi alone. Besides that, she assured him she would discuss the matter with her father, so the Shebest family would provide some support as well, something the young man was counting on. Silence quickly filled the room, and as much as the protagonist tried to keep himself contained, silence was not exactly his strong suit. at least not around Estrella, so he called for her attention and apologized for having said so many harsh things earlier. But to her, it made no difference. She truly hadn't been bothered and actually thought his stance was correct. With the conversation finished, she stood up, ready to leave, while Raven quietly watched her every step, letting out a long sigh after she closed the door. It was as if he were starting to develop a certain fondness for the Lady of Charlene. When she found Na-hwi outside, the boy was excited about everything they had talked about and asked if he could really stay there to become a healer like Estrella and the other relatives. She confirmed it, explaining that he would have to choose only one activity once he became an adult, and until then, he would study as a healer apprentice. The boy thought for a moment before saying very clearly that he really wanted to join that task force, making Estrella even more proud. She patted his head, assuring him that on their next meeting they would discuss it together with Raven. Changing the focus a bit, the two of them looked out at the lake before them. It was a very beautiful sight, and it was strange to think that the place even had an artificial lake, though that was expected from the extravagant Dyer family. That was when she noticed a third presence there, her fiancé, who was staring at them silently. But the girl quickly turned her back, since she didn't have anything to say to him. He was clearly upset. For a moment, she wondered if she should have greeted him as well. However, that thought immediately vanished, because Raven himself had said he wanted to maintain a contractual relationship, whatever that meant. So staying distant from him was the best choice she could make, at least for now. Days later, in one of the city's taverns, people were laughing nonstop. But the protagonist's mind was far from his subordinates. He could only think about Estrella, because it felt like she was deliberately keeping distance from him. She had informed him that starting that day, she would eat only in her room. Later, when he invited her to watch the sunset and take a walk, she simply declined and went on her way. Now, whenever he tried to even touch her, she slipped away from his hands coldly, as if she were more distant than ever. Of course, she said she wasn't upset about anything, but maybe she lied and was still bothered. He could even picture her in front of him, humiliating him, saying that choosing the good of a household over the well-being of a child, and on top of that, being a virgin, was truly pathetic. But at the end of the day, they were complete strangers. He should be happy. After all, he had spent so long clinging to that ridiculous speech about not falling in love and all of that. But now he just felt frustrated with his own decisions. His misery was interrupted by Theo, who arrived asking for help, but Daniel scolded him, saying he wasn't finished with him yet. The poor, innocent soul explained he was tired of hearing all of Daniel's stories about him and his wife, but the second squadron commander teased him, telling him not to be so shy, and insinuated that the captain would love to hear them too. But of course, that wasn't the case at all. Before either of them could speak again, Daniel started ranting about how his wife was born in winter, so she was as pale as snow and had rosy cheeks, tiny lips like a princess from a fairy tale. But the main point of his story was that yesterday, when he arrived home, she had prepared all his favorite dishes. He spent 30 minutes describing whatever atrocity he did with his wife, only to end it by saying that afterwards she got super clingy and fell asleep like a little bunny. But he still had much more to say. He kept talking for another hour to those two poor souls who had lent him their ears. By that point, he was describing his wife's blood circulation and how he warmed her up with his body. Daniel had already fallen asleep in the middle of all that nonsense. But Raven, surprisingly, was listening and wanted to know more about those circulation problems. He asked if by any chance she also had cold hands and feet, which Daniel confirmed. That was enough to make the protagonist thoughtful. Clearly, something was going on. After that, back at the mansion, the young man was carrying a little gift box. He walked back and forth in front of Estrella's room, completely awkward after all. It would be the first time he gave a present to a woman of his own free will, but he had to stop this peak of anxiety when the door suddenly opened, and the girl asked what he was doing there. Nervously, he explained that he wanted to apologize for the situation with Na-hwi earlier that day, and the woman asked whether she hadn't already made it clear that she hadn't been bothered. She didn't even wait for him to respond before walking past him with indifference. But this time he wouldn't give in so easily, stretching out his hand to stop her from leaving. Then he asked why she was avoiding him. Since she said she wasn't bothered, she could at least talk to him. He politely asked for that much. The two of them ended up entering the room to have more privacy to talk, despite the deadly silence between them, and they both tried to break it at the same time. So Raven apologized and asked her to speak first. Estrella thanked him and returned to what he had said earlier to explain that she wasn't trying to avoid him on purpose or anything like that. However, he asked why she had been eating alone in her room. So of course she replied that she thought keeping some distance from him might make the situation more comfortable for him. After all, as the protagonist himself had said, the two of them were not going to become a real family, since that was only a contractual and temporary relationship. Even though that was true, her words hurt him far more than he expected. Still, he gathered strength to say that even though he had no right to say this, since he was the one who pushed her away first, When Estrella told him he was just some random stranger, he felt lonely, because until that moment, he hadn't fully understood what that meant, what it would be like, how it would feel to be rejected. So if he had hurt her, even a little, he genuinely wanted to apologize. However, if it hadn't bothered her, he was also glad that Estrella had been honest with him. It was all so confusing. The lady of Charlene didn't understand why this man was always so sensitive to other people's pain. She understood that he had said many things to push her away for the sake of the Dyer family, and that's why she tried not to be bothered. But if he kept picking up the pain she was trying to throw away, she would end up realizing that deep down she actually had been hurt, if only a little. Before she could say anything else, the young man explained that he had something to tell her, aside from all that, and said he didn't think he had the right to say this either, but before he could continue, Estrella asked whether he didn't think she was a terrible person anyway, shocking the protagonist. However, she went on, saying that saying something like that was simply unfair, definitely not the reaction he was expecting. Even so, he moved closer to her face, touching her gently. But Raven wasn't offended or shaken by her words. Actually, he was mesmerized by a smile he had never seen appear on Estrella's face before. When he realized what he was doing, he immediately became embarrassed, pulling his hand back and apologizing. He was redder than a ripe tomato, wondering over and over why he had done that. Looking away, the girl confessed that she was still a little angry with him, because he had hurt her with his harsh words, and by the way, he always managed to come out on top in situations. But what shocked her the most at that moment was how easily he had said he felt lonely, because that wasn't fair. That one stung. But mainly, what upset her was how easily she had let herself become dependent on the protagonist. Even knowing that his devotion was to the Dyer family above anything else, he always supported the house more than anyone else would, and that hadn't changed. That's why in this life, Estrella wanted to be the one responsible for protecting what mattered most to him. Still, she didn't want them to just pretend nothing had happened. After all, she preferred to continue their relationship without that strange tension between them. So she wanted to propose an agreement to get rid of this conflict once and for all. In my opinion, she was being very mature. And he accepted immediately, like a little puppy. And that didn't go unnoticed by the lady of Charlene, who had to ask him to let go of her hand, leaving him even more flustered. That kind of attitude was not normal at all, and she couldn't help but notice that the young man seemed bothered by something else, which only made the poor guy even more nervous while Estrella stared at him, afraid he might have a heart attack or something from how tense he looked. Finally, with the little courage and dignity he had left, Raven handed her the little box he had been holding outside, explaining that it was a present for her. When she opened it, she was a bit confused, but the young man explained that it was a cream that warmed the skin when applied, helped with cold hands and feet too, probably. He couldn't even look Estrella in the eye while explaining that he thought it might be useful for her, since he knew staying cold wasn't good for anyone's health. Flashes of when the two of them went out together and he let go of her hand because it was too cold appeared in Estrella's mind. There was no way that man, who is basically an anti-romance idiot, had remembered that, but she couldn't help letting out a small laugh before thanking him, assuring him that it would definitely be useful for her. Seeing Estrella so disarmed ended up disarming our boy too. The next morning, he was waiting in the dining hall, staring at the door like a puppy full of hope, waiting for its owner to return home. He tried to accept the situation, reminding himself that although they had agreed to put their whole argument behind them, Estrella never said she would go back to eating with him. However, when he was just about to lose all hope, the girl walked in, apologizing for being late, explaining that Na-hwi had decided to sleep a little longer so he wouldn't be joining them, but that didn't matter. Raven looked much happier just seeing her there. He even made sure to say he would ask the maids to take the boy's breakfast to his room when he woke up. With that settled, they started discussing their upcoming engagement party. So Raven asked if they were really holding it a month from now, as originally planned, because if she had no objections, he would take care of the invitations. And the girl agreed. He also told her he would need to make a trip to the capital that week, but he was planning to stop by the city to take care of a few things. Estrella didn't know why he was sharing so much with her. After all, that wasn't normal at all. She only understood when he asked if she would like to go with him, which made the lady of Charlene smile genuinely. She agreed without even thinking twice, saying they could leave the very next day if he wanted, and that made Raven extremely satisfied. Meanwhile, in another mansion, the red-haired girl who had appeared at the beginning of the story, bragging to her friends that she had captured Raven's heart and would use him for all his wealth, was reading a very important paper. A letter that filled her with such rage that she crushed it in her hands, even scaring her maid when she took out her anger by smashing one of her vases. It was the invitation to Raven's engagement party. She couldn't believe he had truly rejected her to get engaged to that terrible woman. Was he insane? Was he expecting her to simply let things be and allow that atrocity to happen? I mean, those two couldn't stay together. A maid, who looked more like a prisoner than an employee, said she had a good idea. Since the princess would be returning to the capital after a long time away, perhaps it would be nice to host a little tea party to welcome her. And the maid agreed that, given how gentle the woman was, the princess would be very happy. Then she ordered the two of them to prepare the hall quickly. But first, they needed to hurry and clean the mess she herself had made. The imperial capital was enormous. With the engagement invitation sent directly from House Dyer, the entire city was buzzing with rumors about Raven and Estrella. It was almost unbelievable that this engagement was actually happening. But now, with the official announcement, the young noblewomen, who had been convinced the engagement would fall apart, were completely shocked, devastated, as if any of them ever had a chance with the protagonist. They screamed in despair at the idea of Raven becoming someone else's possession, which was strange, treating the poor guy like a designer handbag rather than a human being. Meanwhile, at House Dyer, the young man was meeting with his knights to explain that while he was in the capital announcing his engagement, their activities would be suspended. So until he returned, they could do whatever they wanted with their free time, which surprised Daniel and Theo and even gave them hope. They couldn't believe they were actually getting time off. However, Raven quickly ruined Daniel's excitement by saying he would need him to handle the escort, apologizing for dragging the guys along as his guards. But he made it clear that as soon as they returned from the capital, he planned to give the poor men a break. But either way, he was counting on them. That was enough to make them excited again about the idea of traveling to the capital. The only one not happy with any of this was Kate, serious as always. A few days later, on the morning of their departure, Henry asked them to take care and made it clear he would join them as soon as he finished adjusting the final details of the castle. Then Raven gently extended his hand to his fiancée, who took it without hesitation. Their relationship had greatly improved since that honest conversation. Na-hwi had joined the trip as well and looked very excited to be going out. So the lady of Charlene asked if he was excited to go to the capital, something the boy confirmed. He explained that going out with anyone already made him happy, so he was very glad. And to make him even more radiant, the prince mentioned they would stop in some other cities along the way and asked if he would like to explore a bit. And of course, the answer was yes. Throughout the trip, Kate escorted the carriage from the outside. They passed through many places. Theo, who was also assigned to guard duty, kept Na-hwi entertained with a ring toss toy. They also managed to win a stuffed bear for the boy, and they ate a lot, even though Kate kept his usual grumpy face. At the end of the day, they resumed their trip inside the carriage when Estrella leaned a little closer to the prince. She was tired, so she rested her head on his shoulder unintentionally. Before Raven could say anything, Na-hwi signaled him to be quiet so his new mother could sleep. When they finally arrived at the imperial capital, they settled into the Dyer family's residence there. It was an impressive mansion, and it definitely hadn't been cheap. Estrella was amazed, because only the Dyer family could afford a mansion like that in the heart of the nation. She usually forgot about this detail when she was around her fiancé, but he was the most influential person in the country after the royal family. The young man noticed her staring at him, surprising the lady of Charlene a little. He apologized for keeping her waiting and explained he would talk more about the mansion the next day, but for now it was best if she rested in her room and recovered from the trip. He introduced Nathan, Henry's son, who was the butler of that residence, saying he would guide her to her room. The young man politely said it was a pleasure to be in the princess's presence, mentioning that his father spoke very highly of her and reintroduced himself. Then he looked at the little boy who was watching him, staring with a certain coldness, which was enough to make the poor kid cling to Estrella and ask if the man was going to eat him. But Raven tried to keep things light, explaining that Nathan had been part of the army, so he might look intimidating, but he was very kind, so there was no need to worry. Trying to ease the mood, Nathan asked if he would like a piece of candy, which immediately disarmed Na-hwi. The mansion was truly a jewel in the heart of the capital. They finally reached Lady Estrella's room. Considering the size of the house, that must have been quite the walk. Nathan explained that Na-hwi's room was right next to hers, and he would show it to him shortly. The girl noticed a small envelope on her table, and the butler explained it was an invitation to a tea party that had been sent directly to her. However, the girl didn't seem pleased. It had come from the count's household, so it was hard to imagine what their true intentions were. But as a member of high society, she needed to accept these kinds of invitations for the sake of maintaining public relations with other nobles. Everything on the table was perfect, except for the guests, who remained tense. But the woman asked what was going on, staring coldly at the other girls, before showing a cynical smile, as she always did with those foolish people, and telling them to speak freely without worrying. A flashback from 2 days earlier came to mind. The girl had been talking with Raven, surprising him a bit with the fact that she truly wanted to go to that tea party. She had no idea why his reaction was so exaggerated. Even so, she explained that she wanted to know what was happening in high society and was aware she needed to show up at least once before they got married. It was very strange to see Estrella, a woman known for being terrible, going to a party like that, but all the protagonist could do now was feel anxious. so he held her by the shoulders and tried to use every bit of charm possible to convince her to give up on that idea. However, the girl pushed his hand away, making it clear that this wasn't the first time she attended a social gathering alone and that she had no intention of causing any problems for him, which he quickly clarified wasn't what he was worried about. The truth was that Estrella always seemed very uncomfortable around people in general, so he worried about her well-being. So once again, he tried to persuade her, saying that if she was forcing herself to go because she thought her absence would cause trouble for the Dyer family, she didn't need to do that at all. That reaction surprised the Lady of Charlene, but she soon smiled. He was always so concerned, so she assured him that everything would be fine. But now there she was, in one of the most embarrassing situations she had faced in a long time, and she had already gone through plenty of humiliations at the Dyer mansion. While the other noblewomen chatted, Estrella felt completely out of place. She hadn't been there long and was already exhausted, while the mysterious woman who invited her kept staring nonstop, until she broke the silence, wanting to know if Estrella was enjoying the little party. To which Estrella replied yes, because she couldn't let her real feelings show, even though she doubted the woman believed her. The snake only waited for an opening to say she had been very excited for that gathering. And honestly, she explained that she thought that meeting Lady Charlene in person would help her understand why Raven chose her as his fiancé. That was enough to stop every other conversation in the room. Estrella, in fact, was more bothered by the fact that the girl called her fiancé by his name and not Lord Raven or Prince, which clearly meant she wanted to show how close the two supposedly were. Her friends discreetly supported her. One of them even commented that even as a woman, she also felt overwhelmed by Estrella's beauty, and another reprimanded her, saying she shouldn't imply Raven chose Lady Charlene only because of her looks, and reminded her that this engagement was only possible because of Estrella's local lineage. Estrella was clearly uncomfortable, which greatly pleased the redhead. Suddenly, she brought up a conversation about a young woman they knew, commenting that she had recently gotten engaged, just like Lady Charlene. Her friends, the other rich snakes, laughed while talking about this woman's temper, which supposedly left much to be desired. They even mentioned that many called her a villain, and as far as they knew, her fiancé barely paid her any attention. They kept commenting among themselves how tragic it was for the poor man to have to marry that girl, since with such a terrible reputation, she could never bring happiness to a man, especially in marriage. Estrella ignored their comments while eating her cake because she knew the snakes were talking about her with that little performance, and she was certain it was nothing but jealousy. Even seeing they weren't managing to offend her, one of the girls insisted on knowing Princess Estrella's opinion about all that, and all she did was agree, explaining that she probably would get along very well with that woman. That was definitely not the reaction the girl expected after so much provocation, so she asked what Estrella meant by those words. And Estrella answered that if they were bothered enough to belittle the woman, then they probably didn't like her at all. Following her reasoning, the noblewoman explained that when she didn't like someone, she made sure to destroy that person, guaranteeing that the woman would never even be able to look into her eyes again from the trauma she'd cause, which is why she thought she would get along very well with someone who enjoyed speaking ill of others to their face, and insisted on knowing what that girl intended to do to the young woman who was about to get married. That was enough to pull the ground from under the other noblewoman, who stumbled over her words, only to be interrupted by Estrella offering her help if she wanted. After all, everyone knew, right? Everyone knew she was known for being a terrible woman. Both snakes trembled, defeated at their own game. And now Lady Charlene was insisting that they shouldn't go quiet now. Quickly, one of them stood up apologizing, explaining that she wasn't feeling well and would need to leave, turning her back before Estrella could say anything to keep her there. So Estrella continued sipping her tea with unshakable calm, while the other woman glared at her. Her plan had completely fallen apart. Luckily for everyone involved, time passed, and the woman bid farewell to her host, saying she had had a wonderful afternoon, while the other kept up her performance, thanking her for making time to come despite such a busy schedule. The tension between them was obvious. However, a commotion caught their attention. Some people were commenting on the presence of Lord Dyer, who, for some reason, had gone there, majestic as always, with the same cold gaze, until he met Estrella's eyes. She looked at him with her usual expression, but he immediately opened a magnificent smile. He knew exactly how to make it seem like he was truly in love with Estrella. When the MC approached, Estrella asked if he had gone there just to pick her up, which he confirmed, explaining that he was very worried about how long she was taking. And without even acknowledging the other woman present, he asked Estrella to hurry so they could leave, requesting permission from all the ladies there, who then realized that the rumor was true. But the redhead didn't know what rumor they were talking about, so one of the nobles explained that there had been talk in the capital that the protagonist was actually in love with Lady Charlene. In the end, that was exactly what they looked like to anyone, an affectionate couple. since Raven was all smiles whenever he appeared with her in public. The woman clenched her fists in rage. She wouldn't forgive that, and she wouldn't give up either. She would find some way, no matter what, to make Raven hers alone. At night, in the Capitol Mansion, Estrella's reading was interrupted by knocks on the door. It was Raven, and she immediately asked what had happened. A bit awkward, he invited her for a walk because there was a very special place only he knew, and he wanted to take her there. That invitation alone was enough to make her blush, and without thinking twice, she accepted, interlacing her fingers with his, and being surprised when the protagonist pulled her by the waist, asking her to stay closer. Something she accepted without hesitation. After all, this was the man she loved. A little before that, Raven had been enjoying the tea served by the butler, who said he had had a long day. He was exhausted from all the paperwork since it seemed endless. Then Nathan changed the subject a bit, saying he'd heard there would be a meteor shower that night, suggesting the master could invite Lady Estrella to watch it. It wasn't his style to do such things, and he was only interfering because his father had tasked him with creating a romantic atmosphere for the couple during their stay in the capital. But even though the butler's idea was great, the protagonist suggested bringing Na-hwi along too, to which Nathan quickly responded that waking a child so late might not be ideal, which made Raven give up on the idea. Still, what worried him most was the fact that Estrella had attended the tea party earlier. She was probably tired. Maybe she was even asleep by now. Even so, he tried approaching her, knocking on her door to ask if she was awake. When she replied yes, she immediately asked what he wanted. So he explained that there would be a meteor shower that night, and if she wasn't too tired, he wanted to take her for a walk, including the fact that there was a special place in the palace only he knew, and now she could see it too. The girl took his hand, accepting the invitation gladly. But what her fiancé did next was surprising. Raven gently pulled her close, into a tight embrace. Except the magic didn't last long, because the Lord explained that he would use teleportation magic and needed her close. After all, it could be dangerous if anything unexpected happened. Even so, Estrella nestled comfortably into those massive arms to savor the moment, and the two vanished into the air, reappearing gradually in the middle of a forest. The girl was enchanted by the place. There were beautiful flowers, and the sky was more stunning than ever. She couldn't help but comment that it looked like something out of a fairy tale. Raven was happy that she liked it, because it seemed to be a very important place to him as well. He soon explained that it was one of his favorite spots in the capital, but there was another point he wanted to take her to that night. They would watch the stars from there. Like a true knight, our boy used his coat to cover his future wife, explaining that even though it was summer, the night there was still cold, so it was best to dress warmly. Estrella thanked him. She had never felt so cared for, especially by Raven. He took advantage of being alone with her to ask how the tea party had gone earlier, since she looked exhausted when he went to pick her up, something she couldn't even hide. So she decided to be honest, telling him everything that had happened, ending her story as if it were something normal. But it made Raven laugh until his stomach hurt, especially because she called herself a terrible woman, right to their faces. Lady Charlene didn't know if he was teasing her or not, so she asked if she had done something wrong, confessing she wasn't very good at mixing with nobles. The MC understood that perfectly. He also hated that indirect way nobles talked, which surprised her. Honestly, she thought someone like him would hate the way she handled those situations, but he didn't understand what she meant. To him, it was a great way to handle things. Maybe it was the first time he had praised Estrella so directly. And because he was the type to follow through with his convictions, he added that the other women had started the attacks to begin with, so she was just defending herself. And just to be clear, he explained that he liked strong women very much, the way Estrella was. The girl had no words to respond to that. Maybe it was the biggest surprise she had had with her fiancé lately, but she took the chance to tease him, asking if that meant he liked being put in his place. The protagonist froze, mouth open, before saying, "That's not what he meant." But Lady Charlene insisted it was kind of what he meant. The boy broke into a cold sweat at that tease, but he used the moment to open up, saying that it wasn't uncommon in his country, but his parents had a terrible marriage. Every time his father found a new mistress, his mother became the subject of the entire kingdom, turned into a laughingstock. But she never protested. She endured all that humiliation in silence. He remembered the time she slapped him in the face in one of her fits of anger because of the rumors, when Raven was still a child, too young to understand why he was being hit, since that has no justification regardless of age. Even grown, the memories couldn't be erased. And Estrella seemed to see his soul in that moment. She even pitied her fiancé, without fully knowing why. He took a moment to realize she was looking at him, and even when he met her eyes, Estrella didn't look away. It was almost pity. He tried to lighten the mood, clearing his throat and saying that what he meant was simply that he preferred strong women or even villains like her. That was enough to make Estrella let out a dry laugh, asking if he had any idea how calling someone a villain wasn't exactly affectionate. Still, she knew he was opening up, So she told him not to worry. After all, she was strong. That's why she could protect him too. And Raven smiled genuinely this time. He couldn't believe that this woman, whom everyone thought was despicable and who supposedly didn't even like him, was trying to comfort him. Different from other times, he simply accepted that comfort, saying he would remember it. The forest truly was beautiful, and they finally reached the spot he wanted to show her. Estrella's eyes sparkled at the sight. The perfect meteor shower reflected on the lake before them. They were so mesmerized by the sky that they barely noticed their hands brushing. Both jumped slightly, staring at each other as if sharing a secret. Maybe it was just the moonlight, but even though he had looked into Estrella's eyes many times before, tonight they seemed dazzling, like they could put him in a trance. Sometime later, in the Imperial Palace inside the audience chamber, someone commented that the Duke Dyer's son never stopped impressing. The king thought it was crazy that he had taken in a child from House Shabest. As for the petition to allow young knights to enlist without parental permission, the king admitted he was inclined to approve it for his own military interests. However, the nobles who opposed it would be furious, so he asked if that wouldn't be a problem for the duke, who needed to agree. However, if Na-hwi was capable, there would be no problem at all. Everything the Lord was doing was simply supporting his son's wishes. It was impressive to see that His Majesty still trusted Raven so much. He lamented that the two of them didn't maintain a closer relationship because it could have avoided all the tension between them. Defeated, the king decided to agree, and he asked that Raven be informed he should present himself at the castle as soon as possible. Meanwhile, in the Dyer family mansion in the capital, Estrella wore a scowl deep enough to give her all the possible wrinkles at such a young age. She was facing a horrible problem, which was, at this point, she might accidentally swallow Raven whole with her own teeth. Because ever since the incident with Na-hwi, the boy's attitude toward her had changed completely, for the better. Even the day before, when they were looking at each other as if they were truly a couple in love under the meteor shower. Her frustration was so intense that Estrella slammed her head against the table, alarming her maids who asked what was happening. There was definitely something wrong, because she looked like a crying corpse for no reason. The truth was that she was scared, because if her fiancé discovered that she truly liked him, her whole plan would go down the drain. 6 months earlier, in the house of Lady Charlene, when she regained the memories of her past life, she couldn't even think about marriage, much less meeting Raven again. Because if he really remembered nothing from their past life, even if he was the same soul, she would be meeting a completely different person. But even knowing that, the girl couldn't stop being curious. And the more she learned about him, the more she learned about the Protectors, discovering that they had extremely short lives. She found a list of several Protectors, like Raven, who died fighting monsters. And the one who lived the longest still died at 40. It was horribly unfair. Estrella never wanted to see her fiancé sacrifice himself for anyone ever again. That was why she chose to stand at his side. At least, if their enemies were only monsters, she could protect him with her power, and maybe he could live as long as a normal person. However, noble women were expected to be delicate and subtle. If they were even forbidden from riding horses, imagine fighting with swords. So participating in monster hunts was out of the question. She pestered her father to let her join, but he didn't give in, so she started coming up with excuses to participate. Then, by pure luck, a marriage proposal from Raven landed in her hands. The news sounded like music. The Emperor had suggested a betrothal with the Dyer heir. Her father was already preparing to refuse, but the girl said, loud and clear, that she would marry him. He took a while to process that. How could his daughter want to marry of her own free will? He reminded Estrella that she once said she would rather bring down an entire empire for her selfish choices than marry a man, but she had forgotten that completely. So, unless she wanted the empire destroyed, accepting the proposal was the best choice. She was sure that Raven, being a man who valued loyalty and honored his comrades, would appreciate her power. So she wasn't too worried about negotiating the contract marriage. The real issue was what would happen after the contract. Her original plan was to win his heart during the contract period and extend it permanently. Plan B was to prove she was useful and remain with the Knights as their healer even after a divorce, and then make the MC fall in love with her. Those plans sounded brilliant in her head, but now she knew that if the protagonist discovered her true feelings, Estrella would be kicked out immediately. She snapped out of her trance when someone called her name. For her luck, or misfortune, there was Raven, as stunning as ever, worried because the maid said she was acting strange, and he wanted to know if she was all right. But all Lady Charlene could focus on was that sculpted chest beneath his shirt, and those pants that fit him almost too well. Honestly, I have to agree. His worried expression was almost touching. She felt warm inside when she replied that everything was fine. She could drool right there. He looked more seductive than ever. When he noticed the small bruise on her head, he rushed over in a panic, asking if she had hit it somewhere. Of course, she wouldn't admit she had done it to herself on purpose, so she just said it was an accident. But the boy stepped forward immediately, ready to cast a healing spell on her, telling her to stay still. And so Lady Charlene did as he asked. It was difficult for her to be so close to something she wanted so badly and not be able to enjoy it properly. So she blurted out that if she ever went completely crazy, it would be all Raven's fault, prompting him to ask what he had done. Laughing, she said it was a very unfair accusation. His smile was beautiful. He was beautiful, actually, and denying that would be unfair to anyone. Since her past life, one of her biggest goals was to preserve that joy he had, and now it was no different. That was why, in this life, all she wanted was for Raven to be happy, and for that, she was willing to sacrifice her own feelings. Kate, who was passing by, ended up overhearing their conversation. There was something different in the air. Love, maybe? Because it was like watching a drama. They were practically surrounded by hearts. It was hard for him to believe it. Later, when they were alone, he mentioned that he had seen the couple talking earlier, interrupting Raven's tea. Maybe he was referring to when the girl hit her forehead, but then came the question everyone wanted to ask. Raven, do you like that woman? Even later, in his chambers, the MC couldn't forget the conversation he had with Kate. He remembered the night asking if he truly liked Estrella. Honestly, when he heard the question, he began thinking about how different things might be if he weren't a protector. But he was too realistic to pretend that was anywhere near possible. He opened a book that described his role. Protectors held an immeasurable amount of divine power and strength. They were symbols of heroism for the Empire. At least, that was the public perception. But in reality, those whose mission was to sustain the protective barrier were sacrificed. Just like him, other protectors who received the mark at around 6 years old all died in their early 20s, without exception. And this fact was only hidden because all their power came with a secrecy spell, meaning that even if the boy wanted desperately to ask for help or confide in someone, he physically could not speak the truth to anyone. His seizures grew worse over the years, just as the records said they would. And if this was the same case, it meant our boy didn't have much time left. He didn't even know if he would survive another year. So he had to face the fact that for someone like him, falling in love wasn't really an option, no matter how sad that was. In the mansion's massive library, Na-hwi wondered what he should read next. He proudly showed the book he chose to Estrella. The title was The Adventures of the Holy Maiden and the Guardian Knight. Estrella was excited that he liked adventure stories, and she offered to read it to him on one of the sofas there. But before they could begin, someone found them, their favorite prince, smiling from ear to ear, holding a folder. He walked in at the perfect moment, because he wanted to show that his request had finally been approved. He told Na-hwi that becoming a knight apprentice would be difficult, but he was counting on him, ruffling his hair. However, the boy suddenly began trembling, and then tears streamed down his face. It completely threw Raven off, and he asked what was wrong, and if he no longer wanted to be a knight apprentice. But that wasn't it. The problem was that for the first time since they met, Raven had called him by his name. That left Raven confused, and little Na-hwi explained that it was the first time he had heard him call him by his actual name, and he was very happy. Thinking about it more deeply, maybe Raven had been keeping distance from him, even without meaning to. So he picked him up, smiling, and said that from now on he would call him like that as much as he wanted. So he needed to stop crying, apologizing for not doing it sooner. Lady Charlene teased him, saying that just a simple apology was a little too cold, suggesting that if he really wanted to apologize, he could grant Na-hwi a wish. Our boy agreed she was right, so he asked if there was anything the little one wanted. And shyly, Na-hwi said there was a book he really wanted Raven to read to him, the one Estrella was holding. To his surprise, the protagonist reacted very positively, coming closer and saying he would read it as much as Na-hwi wanted. So he settled in the library and began telling the story of how the Holy Maiden didn't defeat the Demon Lord, but instead became his friend. And after protecting world peace, she and the Guardian Knight who traveled by her side lived happily ever after. And so the story ended. The little boy loved it, and he was already ready to grab another book, running off and leaving the two adults alone. Estrella stared quietly at the book cover while Raven seemed satisfied with that child. Without meaning to, she ended up commenting that in truth, they didn't get married. Luckily, Raven didn't hear it and asked if she had said something, so Lady Charlene managed to change the subject. He was worried and wanted to know why she seemed so dissatisfied in that moment, but all she said was that it wasn't that. She only thought the story could have been a bit more realistic, since the maiden was a beautiful, intelligent, noble woman, while the guardian was just some idiot. Even though the boy wanted to understand her point, he made it clear that she shouldn't say that in front of Na-hwi, because she was speaking as if they knew those people. Estrella thought hard before saying it, that she had known them actually. In that moment, memories of her past life came back, where her beloved called her the Holy Maiden. Back then, Estrella had white hair, but the same appearance and the same deep eyes. The boy, who was Raven, called her out on a date that day. And for the first time, she said out loud to her fiancé that those characters were actually their past lives, surprising him by saying that the two of them had already met before, because in their past lives, they were the magnificent saint and the blessed knight. But of course, she didn't say any of that. She knew that even if she told the truth, she'd face two scenarios. First, Raven would mock her because of this whole reincarnation talk. Second, the protagonist would give a little laugh and ask what was wrong with her, if she had a fever or something. She could never tell the truth, and she was so deep in thought that the Lord had to ask why she suddenly went quiet. So she avoided it, saying it was nothing, just that she had watched a play about that before. So she decided to tease him, making him sigh in disapproval. But that reminded him of a famous theater troupe in the capital that was performing an opera about the magnificent saint and the guardian knight, and the shows would start the next day. Thinking about that, he suggested that the three of them go together with Na-hwi the following week. And the timing of this event left her a little lost, since there was something even more exciting happening that day. But she accepted anyway. It was a great idea. However, she reminded him it would be a special occasion, so she suggested they go as a celebration of Raven's birthday, which was approaching, even though he didn't want it to. Remembering that made the boy lower his head. After all, his death was only getting closer, even if he didn't know that his fiancée knew that too. Before he explained that he already had something planned for that day, so there wasn't much to do about it. He even apologized for ruining her plans, but suggested they watch the opera on the last day of the performance, since they would be leaving soon and he heard that the final show would be special. Estrella agreed. It sounded good. The two were interrupted by one of the servants. Nathan explained that a delivery had just arrived for Raven. That was unusual, since he normally didn't receive much there. Several large crates had arrived, cluttering the hall, and the boy immediately became embarrassed. It seemed a bit excessive for a gift, so he asked Kate who had sent it. Then Kate revealed it had come from someone called Dearest Precious. At least that's what was written on the note. That alone put a scowl on Estrella's face. Raven tried to soften it, explaining that it definitely wasn't what she was imagining, because the little precious one in question was actually His Majesty, complaining to Kate, since he was sure the man knew perfectly well and could have spared them this ordeal. But the knight didn't care at all. It was exactly the king's style, sending something with that sender name just to annoy the MC, as always. However, one of the crates caught the boy's attention even more. His eyes sparkled like a real child's, something Estrella couldn't ignore, since it was unusual to see him like that. And then, holding a box with wine from the southeastern region, he asked if she liked wine, because apparently he loved it. As night fell, he decided to share the drink over a lovely dinner. He looked very pleased with everything. Curious, Estrella asked if he liked drinking alcohol like that, and if he often drank alone. He answered that he preferred drinking with others, so normally he did it with his group of friends. Returning the question to Estrella, who only said she didn't dislike alcohol. In truth, in her past life, she drank quite often, but now she limited herself to a sip or two at parties just to pass the time. Honestly, she didn't even know how much she could drink in her new body without getting sick. However, a single sip of that wine was enough to change all her opinions, because it was very good. And Raven smiled, revealing that it was his favorite wine. Being sincere, he said he was very happy that Estrella liked it as well. It didn't take long before the bottle was going back and forth between them, and the girl became a little tipsy, even taking the poor man's shirt off. He didn't know how the situation had reached that point. He didn't even bother with a cup anymore, drinking straight from the bottle. But when the drink was gone, the girl, still slurring a bit, said she wanted a little more, being scolded by the protagonist, who suggested it was maybe time to stop. Then she stared at him, unreadable. What she was seeing was almost a glimpse of paradise. His amazing abs on full display. Seriously, who could look away from that for even a second? It was absurd. And when she let that comment slip out, it only confused the boy even more. And since alcohol steals every ounce of dignity a person has, she simply said that with such a tempting body right in front of her, it was hard not to jump on him, which was enough to leave the Lord completely disoriented and the girl immediately dying of embarrassment. Even so, she couldn't hold back and said she always thought that way. But the way he acted, so flustered, was too much for her to handle, hinting that he definitely knew what he was doing. So, clumsy and emboldened, Estrella leaned in, touching those strong shoulders, ready to pounce and swallow the boy whole. However, he asked his future wife to stop. He was extremely flustered, red like a tomato, and asked her to step back. But that's not what she did. No, she did exactly what all of us would do right now. She touched him. Her happiness was almost instant. However, the boy couldn't handle it anymore. He pinned her underneath him, holding her arms, which, in my opinion, is not exactly the best way to reprimand someone who's obsessed with you. He He said she was way too drunk and careless, explaining that even if she thought she hadn't said anything extreme, someone else could misinterpret things and attack her out of nowhere. To the MC, that was something she needed to understand once and for all. But our girl reads romance novels religiously, so this was basically a dream coming true, honestly. And as if the situation couldn't get any more embarrassing, she explained that she only acted like this with him. At that moment, the protagonist's heart was beating like an alarm, warning him not to go any further. Except, that new expression on Estrella's face told him everything he needed to know. So, trying to take advantage of the situation, maybe, Raven asked, clearly and directly if she liked him, which triggered a warning inside Estrella, even in her drunken state. But she couldn't hide it anymore, so she decided to tell the truth. Yes, I like you. Which, in my opinion, she would regret deeply. During all that time, Estrella carried only one regret, one choice that would haunt her forever. In her past life, Raven did not give up on her easily. He repeatedly said he loved her no matter what, calling her his dear saint. However, the woman always acted indifferent, no matter how humiliating it was for her. He would always insist, asking if she was ignoring him again, and teasing her by saying he knew she liked him, even though Estrella always made it clear she didn't like Raven at all. Even if she acted mean, the boy only laughed and carried on. It was obvious that his love for her was always there. He never needed to lie or trick Lady Charlene because of it. Every time he said he loved her, he meant it wholeheartedly. One day, when they were alone in the garden, he swore he would protect her even if he had to give up anything. And then he kneeled and asked her to marry him, to which she replied that he could do whatever he wanted, showing she had absolutely no consideration for him. In truth, Estrella was terrified of trusting anyone, and that was why she never managed to reveal her true feelings to the protagonist. So she was certain she was being punished in her new life. In her past life, however, she was shocked when Raven asked them to divorce, with the excuse that he had found someone else he was truly in love with. For some reason, Estrella didn't seem disappointed or surprised. If anything, it felt like she had been expecting it. So Estrella turned her back, saying it was fine, wishing that the boy would be happy, and leaving Raven there, stunned, which makes me think he might not have found anyone at all, but was instead testing the waters to see his wife's reaction. Now, Lady Charlene was condemned to live with that unforgettable regret, a regret that tormented her even now. When the news spread, one of Raven's knights began yelling at the woman, telling her to stop saying such lies, because every time their commander opened his mouth, it was to talk about her. So he refused to believe Raven had fallen in love with someone else. When asked why she hadn't stopped him, Estrella was confused, saying she didn't understand what they meant. But the truth about the MC's fate was much darker, because Raven had died solely to protect her. In order to raise the barrier that repelled all monsters across the continent, a sacrifice was required, and the boy chose to give up his own life in her place, which finally shocked her. Raven's funeral was one of the saddest scenes of Estrella's life, and even then his knights blamed her, saying she knew very well what they had been talking about, how their master loved her, and only her. That was the moment the truth finally hit her. She collapsed to the ground, not knowing what to say, because while Raven was alive, she had never once managed to tell him she loved him, even though he showed her so much love. Now, every moment he ever confessed his feelings to her flashed through her mind like a horror film. Her hands trembled, and she couldn't even speak to herself, so she let the tears flow while she screamed in despair. In that moment, she realized coldly that there was no turning back. She wished she could apologize, deeply apologize, because the only regret she took to her grave was that she had never been able to tell the boy she loved him. So she made herself a promise. If they ever met again in another life, she would remember all of this. And that was exactly why she refused to deny the fact that she loved the boy who was now hovering over her, the lady completely drunk and vulnerable, asking her that question. Of course, it was a tense moment, but she would not break her promise. So she confirmed it, even though this left Raven shocked, because never in her life. The next day, the girl was in her room with the worst headache in the world. She didn't remember being so weak to alcohol, but now she was deeply regretting it because thinking back, although she couldn't deny she loved him, she definitely could have said something better to dodge the question. Now all she had left was regret, and the image of Raven completely stunned above her. But she was an adult after all, so she stood up, determined to talk to him properly. Before she could reach the prince's office, she was stopped by Theo, who, along with Asher, had been looking for her. They'd heard she had drunk a bit too much the previous day, so they brought her some hangover medicine, something she appreciated. Those knights were always very caring toward the people who mattered to their commander. Noticing there were more cups on the tray, the girl asked if those were for Raven, and the knight confirmed it. Then, a little shy, she asked if she could take his portion to him personally, alone. Asher could tell something was off. Maybe they had fought, so he agreed, and assured her he wouldn't let the other knights interrupt the two of them in the room. Then he dragged Theo away by the collar, leaving him calling after Estrella like a little child. When she finally arrived at the protagonist's chambers, the woman announced herself and asked if she could come in. It sounded almost like a surprise to Raven, and for a moment Estrella thought he might not even let her see him after what happened the previous day, but she couldn't back out now. So she opened the door slightly, explaining that she had brought something to help him with the hangover, something that brightened his expression a little as he thanked her for the gesture. The awkward silence between them was unmistakable, but for better or worse, it was Raven who decided to break it, bringing up the previous day, because he wanted to know whether his fiancée remembered clearly the things she had said to him. And that's where we're stopping today, because honestly, this romance is getting out of control in the best possible way. I mean, Estrella confessing her feelings while completely drunk, Raven looking like he just saw the heavens open above him. These two are one emotional disaster away from finally kissing for real, and I'm here for it. Do you think Raven is already in love and just pretending he isn't? When do you think these two adorable idiots will finally admit everything's sober? Tell me your theories in the comments because I'm dying to know what you think. This series is called I've Fallen for the Empire's Greatest Villainess, and today we went all the way up to chapter 25. If you enjoyed the recap, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that little bell so you don't miss the next episode of this chaotic love story. Kisses and see you next time.